The truth was altered, and the Vatican ensured we'd never discover it. Below those gleaming marble surfaces and behind those secured vaults, 50 of the church's most profound concealments rest in stillness. Some have been concealed for ages, while others were locked away just mere decades past. These aren't tales from holy books, but murmured mysteries entombed in rock, prohibited writings, deleted identities, and abandoned ceremonies. Tonight, we journey through the darkness of the Vatican's past, revealing what was hidden and the reasons why. If mysteries like these intrigue you, make sure to subscribe. So get comfortable, shut your eyes, and allow the enigma to reveal itself. There's a sound the Vatican refuses to acknowledge. It isn't the ringing of bells or the rustling of a cardinal's garments. It's the quietness below the cupola. A quietness so profound, so deliberately maintained that it nearly appears to pulse. Overhead, daylight streams through the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. The enormous space fills with gentle reverberations of footfalls and whispered devotions. Yet underneath that hallowed splendour, far below the marble and gilt, exists something entirely different. Not merely stone, but recollection. Not merely remains, but the entombed burden of mysteries. In Christianity's beginning days, when the Roman Empire still dripped with violence and conflict, Christ's followers were pursued through city lanes. Vatican Hill, previously a site of killings and pagan ceremonies, gradually transformed into a location of subtle authority. Emperor Constantine, in the early 4th century, selected this terrain to commemorate a man who'd perished here. A fisherman from Galilee, executed upside down. That man was Peter. And above his resting place, Constantine constructed the original basilica. Yet what he interred alongside Peter exceeded merely a martyr's body. The church expanded. Popes arrived and departed. Rome collapsed and recovered. Still below the new basilica, things remained concealed. Crypts, markings, even fragments of ancient pagan shrines were silently sealed in the ground underneath, not for their protection, but for their erasure. The Vatican transformed into a fortress of darkness where certain tales proved too perilous to share. It wasn't until the 1940s that the quietness below the cupola was interrupted. During maintenance to the grotto under St. Peter's, labourers uncovered a secret chamber. Within were marble tablets, remains, and an enigma. The Vatican commanded the work to cease. Then, discreetly, they summoned a group of specialists. No declarations, no media, merely rumours. Among the remains discovered was one collection, methodically positioned in an alcove marked with primitive symbols. A document was found close by, inscribed in Latin, asserting the remains belonged to the Apostle Peter himself. Yet not everyone concurred. The remains had been relocated perhaps twice. There were indicators of interference. For years, the Church remained silent. It was only in the early 2000s, under Pope Benedict, that the Vatican formally declared the remains were indeed Peter's. Yet by then the quietness had persisted over 60 years. Still today, numerous scholars stay doubtful. Some claim the Vatican modified the account. Others think they shielded it from skepticism. What matters most, potentially, isn't what was discovered, but what was concealed. The quietness below the cupola isn't solely about one man's remains. It's about how authority selects which truths are preserved and which remain in obscurity. And within the Vatican, quietness has perpetually communicated more powerfully than admission. Now we venture further. There's a door without a grip, a chamber without openings, and within it the Vatican preserves its most ancient name mystery. There's a structure inside the Vatican boundaries that virtually nobody witnesses. It possesses no openings, no markers, no accessible doors. Visitors pass it daily without another thought, oblivious that behind those massive stone barriers exists one of the most enigmatic collections in all of civilization's record. It's named the Vatican Apostolic Archive, though for ages it was identified by a different name, the Vatican Secret Archive. The term secret didn't necessarily mean concealed. In Latin, secretum simply indicated private. Yet over time, the definition transformed, and so did the archive itself. What started as a modest collection of papal correspondence evolved into an extensive maze of prohibited information. More than 30 miles of shelving now extend through subterranean passages and secured chambers. Some claim it contains over 80,000 documents handwritten across more than 12 centuries. It's not merely the archive's magnitude that provokes interest. It's the quietness surrounding it. The archive lacks reading areas, no public exhibitions. Even academics must undergo an extensive procedure to petition entry, and most face refusal. What makes the Vatican so guarded of this archive? That inquiry has never received a definite response. One of the earliest accounts connected to the archive originates from the year 1633. That's when Galileo Galilei faced judgment before the Roman Inquisition. He was charged with blasphemy for asserting the Earth orbited around the Sun. The Vatican maintained he was mistaken, yet what transpired inside that courtroom was interred for ages. Only in recent decades was his trial record released from the archive. In the margins were annotations from bishops, some supporting Galileo, some frightened of him. That was the initial revelation. The Church wasn't unified in its verdict. The trial wasn't about reality, it was about dread. Another finding came in the shape of a correspondence from Mary, Queen of Scots, composed just before her death in 1587. In it, she implored Pope Sixtus V to intercede and rescue her existence. The Pope never replied. Some say he never even received the correspondence. Others believe it was disregarded, interred in the archive to prevent discord with England. Still today, the archive holds enigmas that stay secured away. There are whispers of correspondences from Napoleon, confidential communications between popes and monarchs, and even peculiar descriptions of inexplicable illuminations in the heavens. During the Middle Ages, one religious historian once stated, "The archive resembles less a library and more a locked recollection, deliberately modified, firmly regulated." In 2019, Pope Francis altered the archive's designation from secret to apostolic, aspiring to silence the murmurs. Yet a designation doesn't eliminate the history. The structure still lacks openings, and the inquiries only intensify with time. Some accounts are preserved safe from regard. Others are maintained secret from dread. The archive contains both. And as we venture further into the Vatican's record, we start to recognise that what has been concealed was never intended to be located. It started with a resting place, just one, a modest burial positioned into the incline of Vatican Hill beyond the barriers of ancient Rome. The man interred there had been executed upside down. According to tradition, his identity was Peter, and his devotees believed he had been selected by Christ himself. That small resting place, silent and abandoned, would someday become the centre of the most dominant church in civilization. By the early 4th century, the Roman realm was transforming. Pagan deities still governed the empire, yet whispers of the Christian belief were circulating like vapour through the lanes. Then arrived Emperor Constantine, a man nurtured in a realm of numerous gods, yet who professed to witness a vision before combat, a cross of illumination in the heavens. He prevailed that combat, and from that instant forward, Christianity became something beyond tolerated. It became imperial. Constantine reached a daring verdict. He would construct a basilica, a magnificent house of devotion, atop Peter's resting place. Yet there was an obstacle. The location where Peter had been interred wasn't vacant. The hill was section of a Roman necropolis, a metropolis of the deceased. Below the terrain were lines of family crypts, stone caskets, and decorated chambers dating back ages. To construct the new church, Constantine would need to desecrate pagan resting places, disturb aristocratic forebears, and risk enraging both the ancient gods and the Roman privileged. Yet Constantine didn't demolish the necropolis down. He interred it. Literally. His engineers saturated the subterranean metropolis with soil, blanketing the crypts with ground until they were entombed once more. This occasion under the foundations of the new St. Peter's Basilica. The emperor constructed his church atop the deceased, both Christian and pagan, concealing their existence with strata of stone and quietness. For ages nobody spoke of what existed underneath. Pilgrims knelt overhead, never understanding that under the altar were locked chambers filled with abandoned identities. That was the initial genuine mystery of the Vatican, a church constructed atop another realm, concealed in obvious view. The revelation arrived nearly 1600 years afterward, in the mid-20th century. While labourers were maintaining section of the basilica, they penetrated through an ancient barrier. What they discovered astonished them. Vivid frescoes, markings to long-deceased Romans, and crypts unaffected by time. The lost necropolis was genuine. Even more startling was a modest resting place marked with Christian symbols. Remains methodically positioned. Could this have been Peter? Or someone intended to be perceived as Peter? The Vatican initiated a discreet investigation. Some findings were made public, others were not. The reality is still doubtful, yet what is evident is Constantine didn't destroy the history. He interred it, and in accomplishing so, he established the tone for ages of Vatican record. A narrative of belief, yes, yet also of quietness, mysteries, and what exists underneath. For almost 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has asserted St. Peter as its foundation, the initial pope, the stone upon which Christ would construct his church. And still, for most of that duration, the precise location of Peter's body remained an enigma, interred under strata of belief, tradition, and stone. The conviction was modest. Peter had been executed in Rome during the sovereignty of Emperor Nero. His body was discreetly interred on Vatican Hill by early Christians. Ages afterward, Emperor Constantine constructed a church above that location, yet the reality was interred with it, locked under marble and quietness. For over 1600 years, nobody dared disturb what was concealed underneath the altar. Then, in the year 1939, the crypt of Pope Pius V was being arranged beneath St. Peter's Basilica. During the excavation, labourers encountered something unanticipated, an ancient barrier blanketed in crimson plaster, marked with peculiar graffiti. There were Christian symbols, mysterious communications, and the term Peter scratched beside a rendering of keys. The finding shook the Vatican. Could this barrier mark the location of Peter's genuine crypt? Pope Pius V initiated a confidential investigation. A small group of archaeologists was summoned. Over the subsequent decade, they discreetly investigated the region beneath the basilica, revealing an abandoned necropolis. And far within it, near the Crimson Barrier, they discovered a small alcove, a cavity carved into the stone. Within were remains. The remains were ancient, methodically wrapped in fabric, coloured royal purple and threaded with gilt. Was this the evidence the Church had been anticipating? Not everyone concurred. Some stated the remains were too combined, belonging to more than one individual. Others indicated that they had been relocated, potentially in the early ages of the Church. Then arrived the largest revelation. The remains were absent. The Vatican had discreetly extracted them. They were maintained in a wooden container, concealed in a professor's compartment for years, distant from the public vision. It was only in the year 1968 that the remains were brought back out and scrutinized more thoroughly. The findings were enigmatic. The remains belonged to a man between 60 and 70 years ancient. Robust structure, probably of Mediterranean ancestry. The feet were absent, which aligned the ancient conviction that Peter was executed, upside down and had his limbs severed to extract his body from the cross. Pope Paul VI proclaimed the remains to be Peter's, yet critics stayed unconvinced. No markings verified it, no definite records. Merely a discreet verdict reached within the Vatican that belief should occupy where proof fell inadequate. So are they genuinely Peter's remains? Or did the Church select to believe a narrative that had anticipated too extended to be shared? Inside the Vatican, reality is frequently not merely a question of proof, it's a question of belief. And occasionally belief is the perfect concealing location. In the extended record of the Vatican, there have been popes recalled as saints, academics and shepherds. Yet there were also popes who were abandoned deliberately, men who once possessed the crown of St. Peter, only to be eliminated from the records by those who arrived afterward them. These were the popes who eliminated each other, and their narratives have been discreetly concealed behind marble barriers and diminished manuscripts. It started in the early ages of the Church, when the papacy was still developing and authority was anything except stable. In those days, a pope could ascend through sanctity or through governance. Some popes were chosen by aristocratic families, others were compelled into authority by emperors. And when a competing faction seized regulation, the simplest method to reinforce a new pope's governance was to destroy the heritage of the one who arrived before. One of the most peculiar examples transpired in the year 970. Benedict XVI had just been chosen pope, yet Rome was seething with turmoil. A dominant nobleman named Crescentius didn't approve the election. He invaded the Lateran Palace, detained Benedict, and had a competing pope crowned in his position. Benedict was afterwards strangled in detention. His identity was nearly eliminated from record, yet that was merely the start. In the year 965, Pope John XIII perished mysteriously, some stated during an encounter. Others believed he had been assassinated. He had previously been charged of transforming the papal palace into a cavern of transgression. Following his death, two men asserted the papacy simultaneously. Each faction attempted to eliminate the other from the formal records. Some early Vatican documents catalogue one pope, others catalogue the competitor. The reality has been lost underneath strata of modifications, amendments, and quietness. The most notorious instance arrived in the year 897, when Pope Stephen VI was commanded the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, to be excavated and positioned on judgment. Yes, a corpse was positioned in papal garments, propped up on a throne and charged of transgressions against the Church. The judgment was termed the Cadaver Synod, a grim display of authority and vengeance. The deceased pope was determined guilty, divested of his garments and hurled into the river. Yet the narrative didn't conclude there. Following Stephen was extracted and detained, Formosus was discreetly reinterred and his identity was reinstated. Years afterward, another pope attempted to eliminate the judgment itself from the records, pretending it had never transpired. The Vatican's record is moulded by men in white garments, yet some of those men attempted to eradicate others away with ink, with falsehoods, and with quietness. The formal catalogue of popes, methodically maintained by the Vatican, is abundant with gaps and annotations. There are identities that previously were incorporated and are now absent, and still today, nobody fully concurs on how many popes there have genuinely been. When authority transforms, so does recollection, and in the Vatican, abandoning someone can be more dominant than eliminating them. In the powder of the Egyptian wilderness, a single volume was extracted from the terrain, its pages obscured by time, its terms barely readable. What existed within those delicate sheets would shake the Church's record at its very foundations. It was a gospel, and not merely any gospel, it was the gospel of Mary Magdalene. For ages, Mary Magdalene had been misinterpreted. To numerous, she was perceived as little beyond a reformed transgressor, a woman from the darkness of Scripture, yet some academics believed that was never the complete reality. There were whispers in concealed monasteries and behind Vatican barriers that Mary had previously been more, potentially even one of Jesus Christ's nearest devotees, potentially more than that. The The revelation arrived in the year 1945 when a farmer in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, uncovered a locked jar interred underneath a cliff. Within were ancient writings, most of them abandoned Christian compositions. One of them, discovered afterward in a distinct location, was the Gospel of Mary. The manuscript was incomplete. The initial 6 pages were absent. So were the final 10. Yet what remained transmitted chills through the scholarly realm. In this Gospel, Mary doesn't appear as a weeping transgressor. She's an instructor, a visionary, following Jesus' death. While the disciples are frightened and lost, it's Mary who consoles them. It's Mary who states she received a private vision from Christ himself. And it's Mary who provides them courage when their belief starts to diminish. Peter, the very same apostle the Vatican would afterward construct its foundation upon, interrogates her. He disputes her authority, stating he cannot believe Jesus would communicate to a woman in confidence. Mary weeps, not because she's weak, yet because she recognizes how rapidly jealousy can corrupt reality. Another disciple, Levi, arrives to her protection. He reminds Peter that Jesus trusted Mary, potentially more than any of them. What transpired next is a narrative of quietness. The Vatican has never formally acknowledged the Gospel of Mary as section of the Bible. It was excluded from the canon long past in the early ages of the Church. Some contend it was too incomplete. Others state it was too perilous. A woman with spiritual authority receiving visions, instructing male apostles. That wasn't the kind of narrative the early Church desired to maintain. And so the Gospel was interred not merely in terrain, yet in recollection. To this day, the Vatican possesses ancient writings in its apostolic archive that have never been translated, never been displayed to the public. Some academics believe more fragments of Mary's Gospel may still exist concealed there underneath the Vatican's stone passages. The genuine inquiry isn't whether the Gospel of Mary is authentic. The inquiry is why it was concealed in the initial location. What reality about Mary Magdalene was the Church frightened to communicate? And if she wasn't the woman they stated she was, then what else might have been recomposed? Occasionally the narrative excluded from record is the most revealing of all. The wind was frigid that day in Rome, sometime in the early 1500s, when a German monk arrived discreetly under the darkness of the Vatican cupola. He didn't arrive with banners or sermons. He arrived with a correspondence, a private admission, a plea for peace. And that correspondence, now lost or interred, far in the apostolic archive, may have been the final opportunity to prevent the magnificent division that tore the Christian realm in two. His identity was Martin Luther. Most individuals recall Luther for the daring instant in the year 1517 when he fastened his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. They recall him as a revolutionary, a protester, the originator of the Reformation. Yet what numerous abandon is that before the fury and the flame literature, Luther arrived to Rome not as a disputer, yet as a believer. He had travelled over 800 miles to reach the holy city, ascending hills, traversing rivers, carrying uncertainties that weighed more than any pack on his spine. At the time, Rome was a metropolis of splendour and contradiction. The Vatican gleamed with gilt and marble. Yet Luther witnessed something else underneath the terrain. He witnessed priests selling blessings, indulgences exchanged like currency, and individuals paying for forgiveness with their final scraps of bread. The atmosphere around St. Peter's Basilica was saturated not merely with incense, yet with whispers, greed, and quietness. Luther returned to Germany troubled. Still he still aspired for transformation, for reform within the Church. In confidence he transmitted correspondences. One of them, inscribed in methodical Latin, was addressed to the Pope himself. It wasn't an assault, yet an admission of the centre. In that correspondence, Luther implored the Vatican to acknowledge him, to recognise the damage being accomplished, to access the door for dialogue. Yet what transpired to that correspondence? Some state it was disregarded. Others believe it was responded with frigid rejection. There are whispers that a reply was composed by Vatican scribes yet never transmitted. The reality remains interred, secured away in a location where the public will never investigate. Potentially in the silent darkness of the Vatican's archive, there's still a copy of that lost admission sleeping between abandoned pages. What we do understand is what arrived following the Vatican proclaimed Luther a blasphemer. The flames of separation roared across Europe. Cathedrals were demolished, conflicts were fought, and countless existences were lost. Protestant and Catholic families were torn separated, and the church that previously stood as one was never the identical again. All because a correspondence was either unread, disregarded, or simply unwelcome. What would have transpired if the Pope had acknowledged? If mercy had communicated more powerfully than pride? If mysteries had been replaced with comprehension? In the Vatican's extended narrative, there are turning locations where record might have transformed. This was one of them, and it all started with an admission nobody was supposed to witness. In the year 1493, while most of Europe was still celebrating the return of Christopher Columbus, a discreet hand inside the Vatican was rendering invisible boundaries across the realm. With a single document, inscribed in Latin and locked with a ring, the Pope surrendered away half the planet. It wasn't accomplished with armies or conflicts. It was accomplished with ink. The document was termed a papal bull, and it was inscribed by Pope Alexander VI. Its title was Inter Caetera, and on the terrain it appeared like a modest blessing for Spain's new voyages. Yet concealed between its formal terms was a further reality. A separation of territories and souls that would transform the course of record permanently. In brief, the bull surrendered Spain regulation over all territories west of a certain imaginary boundary across the Atlantic Ocean. Everything to the east would belong to Portugal. It was the Vatican's attempt to prevent two dominant Catholic nations from going to conflict over the New World. Yet the outcome was something far more complicated. At the time, maps were incomplete. Nobody even understood how wide the ocean was. The Americas were still being investigated. Still, this one Vatican document determined who would possess what extended before the territory had even been witnessed. No input from native peoples, no negotiations, merely a discreet verdict reached behind Vatican barriers. What most don't comprehend is that there were numerous versions of this bull. Some were duplicated by hand, and each had slight transformations. In some, the boundary was rendered 100 leagues west of the Azores. In others, it was farther. One version, concealed for ages in the Vatican archive, suggests that Spain may have confidentially requested the Pope to transform the boundary again, merely enough to seize more territory. Once explorers returned with new maps, Portugal, sensing cheated, pushed back, and in the year 1494, a new treaty was reached in the town of Tordesillas, relocating the boundary farther west. That transformation is why Brazil communicates Portuguese today, while most of South America communicates Spanish. Yet what if the original bull had not been inscribed? What if the Vatican had not positioned itself as the referee of the identified realm? Concealed within the Vatican's apostolic archive are early compositions of the papal bull. Some academics believe they reveal governance deals reached in confidence. Others state the documents display how much pressure Spain positioned on the Pope, reminding him that his own family had far connections to the Spanish crown. Following all, Pope Alexander VI was a Borgia, and authority had perpetually been a family matter. So when you investigate at a map today, contemplate about how a Vatican verdict, reached in candlelight over 500 years past, still moulds borders, a boundary rendered in secrecy, interred in Latin, and locked by a ring. Not every conquest starts with a sword. Occasionally all it requires is paper. In the silent chambers underneath the Vatican, there's a chamber no visitor has ever witnessed. It's not marked on any map, and its doors are protected not by soldiers, yet by yet by quietness. Within, positioned behind shelves of ancient scrolls and files, are the earliest compositions of a brotherhood more dominant than most individuals comprehend. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Established in the year 1534 by a soldier named Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits weren't intended to be silent monks. They were trained for strategy, obedience, and precision. Unlike any other order in the Church, they seized a fourth vow. In addition to poverty, chastity, and obedience, this vow was to pursue the Pope wherever he transmitted them, even if it indicated traversing deserts, seas, or into the chambers of monarchs. Yet their greatest strength wasn't in where they went, it was in what they never stated. The Jesuits were identified for their quietness, not the peaceful quietness of devotion, yet a sharper kind, the kind that possesses mysteries. In their spiritual exercises, Ignatius instructed his men how to train the mind, how to disregard pain, how to enter uncertainty, and above all, how to never fracture the chain of command. The code of quietness wasn't inscribed in one single document. It was practiced, transmitted down like a whisper in public. They were instructors, scientists, confessors. They mapped the stars, operated schools, and advised emperors. Yet, behind the scenes, their loyalty to the Pope rendered them both admired and frightened. Monarchs started to worry. Were the Jesuits loyal to their country or to Rome? Could they be trusted with mysteries of the crown? By the 1700s, their quietness became perilous. In Portugal, then France, and finally Spain, the Jesuits were charged of meddling in governance, of operating their own darkness empire inside the Church. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV accomplished something unthinkable. He dissolved the order. Formally, the Jesuits were absent, yet not entirely. Numerous of them simply went subterranean. In Russia, they continued to operate with the blessing of the Tsarina in Rome, they anticipated. And merely 41 years afterward, the Vatican brought them back. Today, the Jesuits still serve discreetly in elevated locations. One of them, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, became Pope Francis in the year 2013. He's the initial Jesuit to ever possess the white garments. And even now, some inquire the identical ancient, do the Jesuits serve the Vatican, or do they mould it from within? Their current leader is frequently termed the Black Pope, not because of evil, yet because of his modest black garments and his concealed authority. He doesn't exist in the spotlight, he relocates in the background, leading the most secretive order in the Church. The Jesuit code of quietness remains. Not all mysteries are inscribed, some are existed. And, in the Vatican, quietness communicates more powerfully than terms. In the extended passages of Vatican record, there's one year that stands out like a fractured stone in a perfect surface. The year was 1046. That year the Catholic Church had not one pope, yet three, and one of them vanished from record almost completely. His identity was Pope Benedict IX. He was chosen pope not once, not twice, yet 3 occasions. And still, most Catholics have never acknowledged his identity. Benedict IX was born into authority. His family, the dominant counts of Tusculum, regulated the papacy like it was their personal throne. He was positioned on the seat of St. Peter when he was barely 20 years ancient. Some records state even younger. Imagine a teenage boy barely out of school suddenly governing the most dominant religious institution in Europe, and it didn't proceed well. The Vatican of the 11th century was a storm of corruption, greed, and silent deals. Benedict IX was charged of transgressions that would render even his enemies whisper in disbelief. Encounters, bribes, even violence. Yet the most peculiar section of his narrative wasn't his behaviour, it was what transpired following. In a move that shocked the metropolis of Rome, Benedict IX sold the papacy. Yes, sold it to his own godfather, a man named John Gratian, who became Pope Gregory VI. The exchange was accomplished discreetly behind secured doors. The reason, they asserted, was that Benedict desired to get married. He surrendered up the throne of St. Peter for love, or potentially for guilt. Yet the narrative doesn't conclude there. Not extended following stepping down, Benedict returned to Rome with an army and proclaimed himself Pope again. There were now 2 popes asserting the seat and a third anticipating in the wings. Chaos circulated like vapour through the Vatican. Finally, the Holy Roman Emperor stepped in. In the year 1046, he marched into Rome, summoned a council, and compelled all 3 popes to resign. It was the initial occasion in record that such a purge had occurred. Yet what transpired to Benedict IX? That section remains an enigma. Some state he perished in exile. Others believe he retreated into a monastery and existed out his days in quietness. A few academics whisper that he was confidentially reinstated to a position of authority in the Vatican, yet under a different identity. The formal records grow thin. His trail diminishes like ink abandoned in the rain. Today you can traverse the halls of the Vatican museums and witness portraits of nearly every pope in record. Yet you won't easily discover Benedict IX. His image is absent from numerous of the formal galleries. His identity appears in some catalogues, disappears in others, as if the Church itself selected to abandon him. Yet the stones recall, and occasionally the most powerful Vatican mysteries are the ones eliminated from view. In the silent centre of Rome, near the location where the Vatican's darkness falls across the cobbled lanes, stands a statue that doesn't smile. The man it commemorates isn't a saint. His hands aren't raised in blessing. His face is carved from stone, shrouded by a hood, and his eyes stare down permanently. His identity was Giordano Bruno. He wasn't a warrior. He didn't lead armies. Still, the Vatican frightened him, and in the year 1600 they burned him alive. Bruno was born in Nola, a small town in the Kingdom of Naples. He was nurtured in the belief and entered a Dominican monastery at a young age. For a while he pursued the regulations, he devoted, he studied, he obeyed. Yet his mind wasn't the kind that stayed still. He started to inquire questions that disturbed his instructors. What if the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe? What if the stars overhead were suns with planets of their own? What if those planets possessed existence? These weren't merely ideas. They were in the vision of the Church. They were perilous. Bruno believed the cosmos stretched beyond measure, that no single point held dominion over the infinite dark. He claimed God's work could not be bound to one fragile sphere. He named it an endless universe. To modern ears, it sounds almost beautiful, but in the 1600s, such words were considered blasphemy. The Vatican was already battling the advance of new thinking. The scars of religious division were still raw. The Church craved stability, absolute truth, rigid structure. Bruno offered chaos instead. He spoke of boundlessness, of distant worlds, of spirits that might exist beyond our grasp. And most dangerously, he spoke with conviction. He made listeners believe. For years, Bruno wandered through Europe, always moving before the trap could close. He challenged academics, published writings, and refused to be muzzled. But in 1591, he miscalculated. He went back to Italy. He believed he could share his ideas safely. He was mistaken. The Vatican seized him and kept him imprisoned for 7 brutal years. Throughout that time, they questioned him relentlessly. They demanded he deny everything, that he retract his teachings. He would not bend. On February 17th, 1600, in the early hours, Giordano Bruno was brought to the Campo de' Fiori. A stake stood waiting in the square. They silenced his mouth with a gag. They tore away his garments and bound him to the wood. Then the fire consumed him, but flames could not erase what he saw in the heavens. Centuries passed, and the Vatican quietly acknowledged that Bruno's vision aligned more with discovery than with sin. Yet they never formally absolved him. His remains were scattered by wind, but his legend survives in the forgotten corners of ecclesiastical records. The Church hoped to bury his memory, but the universe he described cannot be erased. It continues endlessly, exactly as he claimed. And perhaps somewhere in that vastness, his words still linger. The first judgment was witnessed by crowds. The second occurred in shadows. Most know the name of Galileo Galilei, the man who peered through glass lenses and discovered moons orbiting Jupiter. What he observed in the darkness above shattered assumptions. It defied the Vatican's insistence that Earth rested at creation's core. In 1633, the Vatican brought him to trial. He was made to kneel, to declare himself wrong, to state that Earth remained motionless. But what followed that public spectacle holds the deeper enigma, because the Church never truly released Galileo, and Galileo never abandoned what he knew was true. Following his public condemnation, he lived under confinement. He was barred from instruction, from publication, from even discussing the heavens. They imprisoned his body, but could not cage his thinking. In the solitude of his estate beyond Florence, Galileo pressed forward. His vision was deteriorating, his strength was fading, yet he spoke his theories aloud to a loyal student. His ideas now reached beyond telescopes. He drafted thoughts on movement, on falling objects, on the principles that would eventually propel humanity into the void. But none of it could circulate openly. Every word he recorded had to evade Vatican scrutiny. Then, within the Vatican archives, something peculiar surfaced. A document written many years later, concealed in a compartment bearing an unfamiliar signature. The document described a gathering, a discreet assembly of church intellectuals long after Galileo had passed. They examined his unpublished work and argued over its fate. Some insisted it remain buried. Others wanted it destroyed completely. But one dissenting voice, perhaps belonging to a cardinal, posed a different question. He asked, if the cosmos follows these patterns, how can they be falsehoods? No formal minutes of this second assembly were ever published. No participants were named. Yet the document remains. A second trial conducted not before judges, but in a private chamber of the Vatican, where his concepts were reconsidered once more, this time without accusations, without pyres, without restraints. What deepens the mystery is that over the following centuries, Galileo's reputation slowly began its resurrection. In 1992, the Vatican formally admitted its mistake in condemning him. But by that point, he had been gone for over 3.5 centuries. Why the endless delay? Some suggest the Church struggled with more than just scientific truth. It wrestled with its own arrogance. Others suspect there were still passages in Galileo's writings, concepts that might challenge doctrine even now. But perhaps the most striking detail is this. Near the very end, nearly sightless, Galileo is reported to have whispered, and yet it moves. A final act of defiance, spoken to the stars. A testament that even when forced into silence, truth continues to turn, just like the planet spinning always, whether witnessed or not. In a forgotten passageway beneath the Vatican, beyond corroded hinges and tarnished locks, there existed a chamber filled not with people's names, but with titles of texts. Hundreds of works were sealed behind barriers both physical and mental, placed on a catalogue known only by its ominous designation, the Index of Forbidden Books. For more than 400 years, this catalogue dictated the thoughts of countless believers. Established in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, the Vatican's index was not merely advice, it was law. A decree to turn away, to cease reading, to erase from memory. Books posed threats, the Church declared, because thoughts could ignite more fiercely than flame. And so the censorship began. The texts condemned were not limited to sorcery or false teaching. Some addressed science, like Galileo's observations. Others contained poetry, like Dante's Journey through the Afterlife, which briefly fell under suspicion. Even philosophers like René Descartes and Immanuel Kant appeared on the list. Fiction, philosophy, verse, entire collections banned with a single decree. But here the mystery grows stranger. While the Vatican prohibited others from accessing these works, copies of nearly every one were discreetly preserved in the Apostolic Archive, locked away, safeguarded, examined only by authorized eyes. What provoked such fear? Among the most contentious entries was On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres by Copernicus. It declared Earth was not creation's focal point. The Church worried that if people questioned the cosmos, they might also question Rome's authority. Yet perhaps the oddest inclusion was a text that addressed neither astronomy nor science, but inner devotion. It was titled The Imitation of Christ. Though generally accepted, certain versions were forbidden, not for their content, but for their effect on readers. They instructed believers to discover God within, without clergy, without papal guidance. To certain Vatican authorities that represented a threat greater than heresy. That was autonomy. Throughout the ages, banned volumes were carried secretly into towns, transcribed by candlelight, shared in hushed voices. Scholars tucked them into their clothing. Priests studied them behind bolted doors. For every volume reduced to ash, another endured. In secrecy, the forbidden survived. And the greatest irony of all, in 1966, the Vatican quietly dissolved the index. No acknowledgement, no ceremony, only silence, as though 4 centuries of suppression had simply never occurred. But even today, deep within the Vatican's hidden chambers, the catalogue persists. The books remain. The words have not faded. It raises questions not just about what was banned, but about what never appeared on the list at all. What manuscripts were obliterated entirely? What narratives did the Vatican dread so profoundly they chose to eliminate them before anyone could even commit them to paper? Sometimes the true enigma is not the book you cannot access. It is the one whose existence you never suspected. She carried many titles, but history recalls her only as the Witch of Rome. No inscription bears her actual name. No sacred day commemorates her life, and the Vatican never confirmed she was real. But documents buried in the Church's most ancient chambers reveal another narrative, one of concealment, terror, and a quiet killing meant to be forgotten. She lived in Trastevere, along the Tiber's edge, in a tilted house with blue shutters and vines climbing the walls. To the struggling women of Rome, she was a healer, someone who assisted in childbirth, a woman skilled with plants, who murmured blessings over labouring mothers, who lit flames for infants born weak. She was valued in her community, perhaps even cherished. But affection in certain quarters of the Church offered no shield. It was the late 1600s, an era when the Vatican's authority over Rome was absolute, yet superstition still seeped into marble halls. Somewhere between faith and power, the boundaries became unclear, and in this confusion the charges emerged. A nobleman's spouse perished during delivery. The midwife had attended. An infant arrived frail. The midwife had touched it. Wine turned sour in a bishop's storage. Someone spoke her name. Within weeks, rumours twisted into accusations. The Vatican had always been wary of women who operated beyond its control, particularly those who touched birth and death with their own hands. She was called in, interrogated, and according to one hidden document, subjected to torment quietly beneath the Holy Office. The document was discovered centuries later by a Jesuit researcher. It bore no signature, and the ink had weakened, but the message was unmistakable. She refused to admit guilt, not even when the instruments were displayed. They charged her with sorcery, with summoning spirits, with taking life from newborns and offering it to darkness. There was no public trial, no bonfire in the plaza, only a black cell beneath Vatican City and one morning an abandoned room. Her execution was so concealed it appears in no official documentation. But years afterward, one of the interrogators who had questioned her recorded a single sentence in his personal journal. Her prayers were not directed at Satan, they were pleas for compassion. What became of her dwelling in Trastevere is uncertain. Some claim it was demolished, others say it still stands silent and observing like a forgotten remnant in Rome's ancient jaw. But what haunts most is not her death, but what the Church did next. Because within one generation, the Vatican began embracing midwives once more. They promoted education, they endorsed women in healing. It was as though someone, perhaps one pontiff, perhaps several, had quietly recognised an error. But they never spoke her name. Not in homilies, not in correspondence, not even in devotion. He was an unassuming man, a scholar of mathematics and celestial bodies, and his identity was erased almost as swiftly as it was recorded. Inside the Vatican's walls, he was known simply as the Jesuit who questioned too persistently. But beyond those boundaries, in the dusty margins of prohibited texts and fading correspondence, he is remembered as the Jesuit who discovered too much. His account begins in the early 1700s, during the height of Jesuit influence, when their reach extended across continents into science, governance, and the Catholic Church's deepest chambers. He was born in Florence, blessed with a mind built for mathematics. By 20, he had committed entire volumes of computation and theology to memory. The Church welcomed him into the Society of Jesus, celebrating his intellect, eager to direct it. He was assigned to the Vatican Observatory, that peculiar and isolated tower where priests examined the heavens not to worship them, but to comprehend the divine order written in the stars. And that is where complications arose. The young Jesuit began releasing modest papers. Initially, they were approved. He wrote about stellar motion, about comets and timekeeping, about how ancient texts might reconcile with modern findings. But gradually his conclusions shifted. He started suggesting that Earth's origin did not match a literal interpretation of Genesis. He implied that time itself extended further than the Church was willing to acknowledge. One paper proposed that Noah's deluge might not have covered the globe. Another questioned whether the sun had always burned identically. The admonitions arrived swiftly. A bishop appeared at his quarters late one night, carrying no light, only a folded message. Inside was a phrase in Latin: "Silence is obedience." But the Jesuit continued. He began drafting a manuscript. It bore no title, only a red leather binding. And within he outlined a concept that challenged the foundations of doctrine. He proposed that the cosmos might be limitless, that God had fashioned numerous worlds, that Earth was not creation's centre, not even spiritually. He never completed that manuscript. One dawn his quarters were discovered vacant, no evidence of conflict, no parting words, only scattered calculations left beside his telescope. The Vatican released no announcement. His identity was erased from institutional records. His calculations were collected, sealed, and stored deep within the Apostolic Archive. And within 12 months, another priest had assumed his position at the observatory, one who never gazed too intently at the stars. What happened to him remains among the Church's quiet enigmas. Some believe he was relocated to a monastery, others suggest he vanished into exile. But one rumour persists, that before his disappearance he sent a single copy of his red manuscript to an associate in Spain. And that somewhere, concealed in a forgotten collection, the truth he glimpsed in the cosmos still awaits discovery. In the hushed corners of the Vatican during the late 20th century, an unusual dread began spreading, not only among believers but within the Church hierarchy itself. It was mentioned in private confessions, suggested in homilies, and buried between the lines of internal communications. The fear was not of conflict, or false doctrine, or even political disintegration. It was something more ancient, something more sinister. It was the fear that Satan had infiltrated through the cracks. The year was 1983. Across the United States, media outlets were saturated with accounts of hidden rituals, dark ceremonies, and children describing things beyond their comprehension. Childcare facilities were investigated, households were destroyed, and though it appeared distant from Rome, the Vatican monitored carefully. Because within its own corridors, certain clergy had begun reporting unexplainable occurrences, events that could not be dismissed as mere psychological phenomena. An aging exorcist named Father Benedetto had worked in Rome for over 4 decades. He was not someone prone to exaggeration or myth. He seldom shared details. But in a report discreetly submitted and sealed by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he stated he had witnessed something during a routine blessing just beyond the city limits. A child, barely 7, spoke in a voice that did not belong to him. He spoke in Latin, flawlessly. He described concealed symbols carved beneath the altar of a neighbouring church. When the site was examined, the markings were located exactly as he had indicated. But the revelation came later. When church authorities questioned the local priest about the engravings, he confessed something troubling. He stated he had noticed them as well, years before. But he had been instructed by someone influential in the diocese to keep silent. It is not our responsibility to awaken shadows, he was advised. Additional accounts followed. A group of nuns from Spain reported discovering a volume bound in dark leather concealed behind a false panel in a convent basement. Its pages contained symbols, procedures, identities. One of those identities corresponded to a senior figure in the Vatican's financial division. The volume disappeared before anyone could study it thoroughly. The sisters were quietly reassigned. For the Vatican, the crisis was not solely about demonic forces. It was about authority. If satanic elements truly existed within the church, it could dismantle centuries of power. So a resolution was reached. Inquiries were conducted underground. Documentation was suppressed. The church proclaimed the panic a manifestation of collective hysteria, a consequence of anxiety and confusion. But inside the secret archive, new files were being categorized, not by accused names, but by geometric shapes, circles, triangles, eyes. To this day, the Vatican maintains there is no proof of satanic presence within its walls. But among certain archivists and exorcists, an uneasiness lingers. Not because they fear the devil might be concealed inside the church, but because they are uncertain he ever departed. It occurred on a frigid spring dawn in 1979, shortly after the bells of St. Peter's Basilica echoed across the Vatican. The choir was preparing for Easter liturgy. Vestments were arranged, voices rehearsed with gentle Latin melodies. The morning light filtered through the enormous stained glass windows and spread across the weathered stone floors. But something that morning felt off. The choirmaster, Father Tommaso, was a reserved man, recognized for his dedication and flawless pitch. He had served the Vatican for nearly 20 years, conducting voices in worship beneath Michelangelo's masterpiece. But on that morning, he was delayed. The singers assembled in the choir loft, a space elevated above the main hall, adjacent to the organ pipes. When Father Tommaso finally entered, his face was ashen, detached. He remained silent. He merely lifted his hand and began the rehearsal. Initially, the music flowed smoothly, but then the harmonies started fracturing. Sopranos sang incorrectly, tenors faltered, one child covered his ears and wept. No one could locate the proper note. Then an eerie sound emanated from the organ. No one had approached it. The organ groaned low and prolonged, like breath drawn in darkness. The choir went silent, and that is when Father Tommaso fell. Initially it seemed like cardiac arrest, but what they discovered in his grasp revealed another story. Clenched between his fingers was a fragment of parchment torn from a larger sheet. It was covered in ink, but not Latin. It was an unknown script, illegible, coiling like tendrils. The paper was warm, even hours afterward, as if it had just emerged from fire. The Vatican launched its own inquiry, discreet, internal. No information reached the public. The choir loft was closed. Rehearsals were relocated. Father Tommaso was reported to be recuperating in a medical facility, but he was never witnessed again. 2 months afterward, a young seminarian named Luca, who had assisted in cleaning the choir loft, stepped forward. He stated that inside the organ he had discovered something wedged between the pipes. It was a small artifact carved from stone, no bigger than a fist. It resembled a face, but not human. Its eyes were deep and vacant, its mouth stretched wide in agony. He surrendered it to a Monsignor who instructed him to forget it. Days later, Luca departed the seminary and vanished into private existence, the artifact gone. Officially, it never existed, but within the Vatican the account became a whisper among the elder clergy. Some believe the artifact was part of a much older relic, one reportedly taken from a church in southern Syria during the Crusades. Others considered it simply legend, a cautionary tale to discourage young priests from asking too many questions. Yet the choir loft remains sealed to this day. No one performs there anymore, only emptiness. But occasionally, if you listen carefully, after dusk, they claim you can still detect a single tone emanating from the organ, played by invisible hands. It was the evening of September 28, 1978, when the Vatican grew still beneath a sky of silent stars. Inside the Apostolic Palace, Pope John Paul V withdrew to his private quarters, following the customary routine: devotions, comfortable shoes, and a warm cup of tea. By dawn, he would be deceased. At merely 33 days into his pontificate, the abrupt death of the gentle, modest Pope stunned the globe. The official determination was heart attack. No post-mortem examination was conducted, no burial images were distributed, and the teacup that had rested by his bedside, the one he had sipped from just before sleep, disappeared. But the enigma of Pope John Paul I's death did not originate that evening. It originated weeks prior, when he privately informed a trusted assistant he planned to restructure everything. He had observed enough in those initial days to recognize that something was profoundly corrupt inside the Vatican's corridors. He mentioned reorganizing the Vatican financial institution, which had fallen under questionable influence. He suggested removing multiple influential bishops, and most audaciously he referenced reviewing certain long-standing teachings, including matters the Church had not addressed in ages. He made these commitments with a gentle voice and a warm smile. But for some, that smile posed danger. When his body was located the following morning, it was not by a physician or a security officer. It was a nun, Sister Vincenza, who entered the chamber to discover him still in bed, sitting upright, as if frozen in contemplation. His spectacles remained on his face. Several pages of a devotional text were folded beside him. The teacup was missing. The Vatican acted rapidly, excessively rapidly, some suspected. Before midday, announcements were issued. The body was prepared. No autopsy would be performed, they declared, out of reverence. But speculation quickly circulated in Rome's stone pathways and in the shadowed regions of the Catholic sphere. Some whispered of a confidential roster. The Pope had documented names of those he intended to dismiss. Others indicated a silent conflict within the Curia, competing factions struggling for dominance behind closed doors. The Vatican financial institution particularly had connections reaching into Italian governance, commerce, and even criminal organizations. And Pope John Paul I had begun investigating. Subsequently, a journalist asserted he had viewed the original cup. He claimed it had been transported to a private laboratory and analysed. Minute quantities of digitalis were detected, a potent plant toxin capable of stopping the heart without leaving evidence. The Vatican rejected the assertion. The journalist perished 2 years later in a vehicular collision. declared an unfortunate tragedy, but the narrative persists in the shadows of Vatican chronicles. Some claim the gentle Pope was too compassionate for a place where secrets run deeper than foundations, and that his tea, warm and comforting, contained not solace, but termination. A termination delivered one final time from a contaminated cup. The leather was fractured. The pages smelled of combustion and ancient rock. It was not scripture, but it had existed longer than many who possessed one. Concealed beneath floorboards, in a neglected corner of a Roman seminary, the Vatican's most confidential logbook had been withheld from the world for nearly 4 decades. It belonged to Father Lorenzo Mancinelli, a Vatican-trained exorcist who operated discreetly from the early 1960s until his disappearance in 1984. No one was meant to locate it. Inside the compact logbook were handwritten annotations, identities, sites, dates, and detailed descriptions of what Father Lorenzo termed encounters with non-human intelligences. The Church had classified them demons. He identified them as watchers. The Vatican never publicly recognized this logbook, but one former archivist, who insisted on anonymity, stated he handled the log before it was classified. He recalled one passage particularly. It stated, "The eyes did not blink. The voice emerged from behind the teeth, but the mouth remained motionless." Father Lorenzo had conducted over 90 authorized exorcisms throughout Italy, Switzerland, and southern France. Most were never documented by the Vatican's formal channels. His operations were performed discreetly beneath local parishes and convents, distant from media attention. In one instance from 1971, Lorenzo described a young girl in a rural village near Naples. She had no medical history, no indications of trauma. Yet when the priest entered the chamber, the girl whispered in flawless Latin, a language she had never studied, and identified each transgression he had committed over the past 2 decades. Her voice, he documented, was masculine, resonant, and originated from inside her chest, as if it had never travelled through her mouth whatsoever. The Vatican directed Lorenzo to cease documenting his encounters, but he persisted secretly. In a subsequent entry, dated May 1983, just 1 year before he vanished, he described something disturbing. During a private exorcism in a church basement near Milan, the subject started speaking in dual voices, one elevated, one bass. The bass voice declared, "We are permitted entry because they summon us through." Sound, through illumination, through recognition that entry was circled in crimson. Many within the church suspected Father Lorenzo had ventured too far. He was summoned back to Rome. The logbook concludes with a brief, final statement. "They have requested I destroy the records. I refuse. Truth does not fear combustion." 3 weeks afterward, Father Lorenzo was absent. Some believe he escaped, others fearing retribution. Others whisper he was eliminated by those who feared his knowledge. The official Vatican declaration was concise. Father Lorenzo has withdrawn into quiet contemplation. But the logbook remained forgotten, buried beneath floorboards in silence and in the tranquility of darkness. In the oldest sections of the Vatican, there are those who still examine his words, not for solutions, but to preserve what should never be articulated aloud. Beneath the stone pathways of Vatican City exists a chamber few have ever accessed. There are no markers directing to it, no entrances obviously labelled. But behind one oxidised iron barrier, past a hallway where even the atmosphere seems more ancient than existence, rests the Inquisition vault. It is claimed that this chamber contains some of the most disturbing secrets in the Church's extensive chronicle. Admissions inscribed onto paper by flickering light, signed with shaking hands, and concealed where no daylight could penetrate. For centuries, this vault was the centre of suppression. In the initial years of the Inquisition, which commenced around 1231, thousands faced accusations of heresy. Some were intellectuals, others spiritual seekers. Many were simply terrified villagers who uttered the incorrect phrase in the incorrect location. Their destinies were determined in shadowed chambers by men in black vestments who believed they were defending God's truth. What few recognize is that the Church maintained documentation of every proceeding, every admission, and every final moment. One such record, revealed in the 1970s by a Jesuit investigator named Father Matteo Rocchi, recounted a woman named Elisabetta della Torre. She was apprehended in 1646 for possessing a volume written in an unidentifiable language. The pages were saturated with symbols and illustrations, celestial bodies, vegetation, and figures without faces. The Church labelled it a sorceress's manuscript, but Elisabetta asserted it was a gift from a celestial being. During her questioning, she informed the inquisitors something peculiar, that the volume could only be deciphered by lunar light, that under complete moons, words materialized that glowed like flame. Father Rocchi's report on her case vanished shortly after submission. The volume never witnessed again. What troubled Rocchi most was not the substance of the file, it was how it was classified, not under heresy, but under knowledge preservation. This classification was employed only a limited number of times throughout centuries. Documents bearing that designation were maintained in the Inquisition vault, separated from the remainder of the Vatican archives. There is speculation whispered among certain academics that one passageway within the vault was constructed not to archive documents, but to confine individuals. Stone chambers? No openings. Iron restraints in the walls. The Church has never validated this, but during an uncommon inspection in 2003, a Vatican representative acknowledged discovering unmarked cells beneath the chamber. Yet the most disturbing discovery may have occurred in 2015, when restoration labourers in an adjacent corridor unearthed a sealed container. Inside were charred pages, numerous of them. Most were indecipherable, but on the concluding page, a sentence endured. "Forgive me, Lord, for I did not fabricate, only attended. No one comprehends who composed it, no identity, no date, only a voice imprisoned in ink, awaiting centuries to be acknowledged." They claimed it was counterfeit, that the Shroud of Turin was merely a skilled medieval fabrication. In 1988, the announcements were assertive. Scientists had examined a section of the linen fabric allegedly used to wrap the body of Jesus Christ, and their determination was definitive. The analysis dated the material to the 1300s, too recent to originate from the 1st century, too recent to be genuine. Yet something about that conclusion never resolved. The shroud is maintained under stringent security in a cathedral in northern Italy. Its faint impression, a bearded figure, arms positioned, wounds apparent, has been central to Vatican enigma and theological discussion for centuries. Pilgrims arrive from across the globe to witness it briefly. The Church has never proclaimed it authentic, but they have not refuted it either. What many failed to comprehend at the time of the carbon analysis was that the scientists only sampled one small portion, a corner that for centuries had been manipulated, exposed, and potentially even mended. In reality, that corner displayed evidence of a repair, a woven segment added during the Middle Ages following a fire that had nearly obliterated the shroud. The fabric there did not correspond to the remainder. One woman, textile specialist Mechtilde Fleury Lemberg, observed this. She had examined ancient fabrics for decades. When she investigated the shroud, she immediately identified an invisible reweaving method that had not been revealed before the analysis. According to her, the threads in that corner were not authentic to the cloth whatsoever, but it was not solely threads concealed. In that identical corner, investigators in 2015 uncovered a faint tear, barely perceptible, where the repair joined the original linen. Under magnification, the weave patterns shifted, like two voices speaking simultaneously. It was a subtle indication that the sample analysed in 1988 may have conveyed the incorrect narrative. Subsequent analysis, utilising new methods and incorporating infrared illumination and X-ray imaging, disclosed something extraordinary in sections of the shroud, untouched by fire or repair. The chemical age of the fabric traced back to the 1st century, approximately the same period as the crucifixion. Yet the Vatican remains cautious. Formally, the shroud is a symbol of devotion, not a verified relic. But privately, behind secured doors, academics and cardinals alike whisper about the impression burned into the cloth. An impression that some assert was not painted, but seared by an abrupt burst of illumination or energy, as if the body within disappeared in a moment of incomprehensible force. So now, when pilgrims observe the shroud, they no longer question if it is genuine. They question, what if it is? And if it is, what does that signify for everything we assumed we understood? They claim it pierced Christ's side as he hung on the cross, and that whoever controls it holds humanity's fate in their grasp. The spear of destiny, also identified as the Holy Lance, is not merely a relic. It is an instrument of prophecy, authority, and conflict. And today it rests in a museum in Vienna, motionless and undisturbed beneath a glass enclosure. But its passage there was anything but tranquil. The Vatican has long maintained its separation from the spear. Formally, it is not catalogued among its relics, but within the archives, the narrative of the spear runs profound, with correspondence, documentation, and private annotations exchanged between pontiffs, warriors, and emperors. The narrative originates in the 1st century. A Roman soldier, frequently identified as Longinus, thrust his spear into Jesus' side to confirm his death. According to the Gospel of John, blood and water flowed out, and for centuries that single action became one of the most sacred and violent moments in Christian chronicle. The spear was allegedly transported to Rome, then Constantinople, and eventually fragmented. One fragment was claimed by the Vatican, another passed into the possession of the Holy Roman emperors. That is the one now preserved in Vienna. But the most disturbing aspect of the spear's legend emerged in the 20th century, during Adolf Hitler's ascent. In 1913, Hitler visited the Hofburg Museum in Vienna. There he stood before the Spear of Destiny for extended periods. According to one biographer, he subsequently stated he experienced a vision while observing it, a moment that transformed his existence. When he seized power, the spear became a fixation. By 1938, Hitler had conquered Austria, and with it, the spear. It was transported under heavy security to St. Catherine's Church in Nuremberg. Many suspected he thought possessing the relic granted him divine legitimacy. He constructed his Third Reich on legends of ancient authority. And this relic, this instrument, aligned perfectly with his distorted vision. But in the closing days of the conflict, something unusual occurred. The Allies, commanded by General Patton, recovered the spear on April 30th, 1945. Just hours afterward, Hitler was discovered deceased in his bunker. Was it coincidence, or had the legend materialized that whoever relinquishes the spear relinquishes their existence? The Vatican never claimed the spear, though it possessed every opportunity. Instead, they observed from the shadows. Perhaps they recognized something. Perhaps they believed the prophecy. The spear remains in Vienna, behind glass, in a city that resonates quietly with chronicle. But occasionally a visitor will lean in, closely, their breath obscuring the glass, and they will wonder, is this the genuine one? And if it is, why did the Church never reclaim it? There is a chamber in the Vatican museums where few pause. Its walls are adorned with ancient reliquaries, each one containing a fragment of a saint, a martyr, or a miracle. But positioned discreetly behind an elaborate glass enclosure, wrapped in weathered cloth and gold decoration, is a relic that has mystified and disturbed the faithful for centuries. A human skull claimed to be the head of John the Baptist, yet it is not the sole one. Across the globe, in locations as dispersed as France, Syria, and Montenegro, there are additional churches that also assert to possess the severed head of the man who baptized Christ. Each one is protected, venerated, and exhibited as the authentic specimen. Every purported relic has a distinct origin story, and curiously, the Vatican has never officially stated which narrative is accurate. The scriptural accepted account states that John was executed on the order of Herod's stepdaughter Salome. His severed head was then presented to her on a silver dish as a trophy. But what became of the head after that point, where it went, and how it was preserved, is among the oldest puzzles in the history of Christianity. According to popular belief, John's initial disciples recovered his remains and interred them secretly to prevent them from being desecrated. The head was supposedly found centuries later in Jerusalem by a travelling monk. He transported it to Syria, and a sanctuary was later constructed there. However, as the church expanded over time, new artefacts emerged. Another skull was supposedly found in Amiens, France. A third appeared in a Balkan monastery. Each was claimed to be genuine. All were revered by those on pilgrimage. In the early 1800s, archivists at the Vatican began compiling a list of these competing relics. Private correspondence between high-ranking clergy shows mounting alarm. One cardinal famously wrote that it is impossible for a single man to possess 3 heads, unless John's body was fragmented in a manner unknown to science. Despite this, no definitive ruling was ever issued. No relic was formally dismissed as fake. Some speculate that the Vatican's continued silence is a calculated move. By allowing every tradition to thrive, the Church maintains unity even amid the mystery. Others believe the truth is concealed deep within a sealed archive, where a secret report supposedly details carbon dating performed on the skull kept in Rome. A retired Vatican scholar claimed to have briefly seen the report. He characterized the findings as complicated. The bone was older than they expected, dating not to the Middle Ages but closer to the 1st century. Yet it had been moved, reburied, and potentially altered over the years. He concluded his statement with a cryptic thought. Whether or not it is truly his head, it preserves the memory of faith. And so, the relic remains, locked behind glass beneath the eternal silent regard of saints. It is more than just an artifact. It is a potent reminder that in the very centre of the Vatican, even the most sacred narratives can hold multiple interpretations. The second story begins in the 4th century with an empress touring the Holy Land. Her name was Helena, mother to Emperor Constantine, and she embarked on a mission not of war but of spiritual discovery. Her singular purpose was to locate the cross, the very one upon which Jesus was crucified. After searching throughout Jerusalem and interviewing local Christians, she reported finding 3 wooden beams buried under a ruined shrine. She was convinced one of them was the authentic cross. She carried it back to Rome, and from there the legend grew exponentially. Over the following centuries, tiny pieces of that cross were taken and distributed across the Christian world. Churches displayed them inside ornate gold casings. Rulers and pontiffs guarded them as precious treasures. Knights carried them into battle, certain that they held supernatural power. Today, hundreds of churches assert ownership of a piece of the true cross. Some commentators suggest there are enough fragments worldwide to construct an entire ship. The Vatican, however, safeguards one of the oldest and most classified pieces, a sliver sealed in a crystal container kept deep within its collection of sacred objects. It is never placed on public view. Most visitors never learn of its existence. Its reality is confirmed only through a handful of Vatican inventory lists, which are themselves intentionally vague. In 2012, a small group of academics was granted rare permission to examine certain relics for preservation purposes. Among them was a French historian named Luc Moreau, who described the profound moment he saw the relic box. The wood inside, he recorded, was dark with age, splintered on one side, and bore a faint scent of both smoke and incense. Moreau noticed a mark carved into its base, not Latin, but Greek. A single word, phos, meaning light. That single word revolutionized his perspective. Moreau theorized the Vatican's fragment might not have originated with Helena's find, but from a different piece concealed in Constantinople before the Crusades. If this proved accurate, the Vatican's artifact would be not merely older, but perhaps one of the very first to ever be venerated. When Moreau submitted his study, he was informed that the file had been permanently sealed. A few months later, he was quietly removed from the research team. Rumours persist that the Vatican secretly conducted carbon dating on the wood. The results have never been publicly released. Some within the Church believe the outcome was startling, perhaps too startling. Others suggest the test never happened, out of a genuine fear that scientific proof might confirm something either too overwhelming or too disappointing. And yet the fragments endure. Worshippers continue to kneel before gold-framed splinters of wood throughout the world. Some pray for a cure, others for verification. But the Vatican's own piece, kept hidden, unspoken, and protected, offers a different interpretation. It is a story not of absolute truth, but of authority and control. It shows how even the tiniest piece, shrouded in deliberate mystery, can carry the entire weight of human belief, and how the final truth, much like the wood itself, may forever remain just beyond reach, silently resting under glass. It is the one book the Vatican will not openly mention. Deep inside the apostolic archive, behind rows of brittle scrolls and ancient leather-bound manuscripts, there is rumoured to be a black volume closed with chains and sealed with wax. It is conspicuously absent from the official library catalogue. Its contents are handwritten in a language that no contemporary scholar can fully decipher. Its name, whispered only among a select few archivists, is known simply as the Gospel of Satan. The manuscript's journey begins not in Italy, but in the desolate sands of the Egyptian desert near the town of Nag Hammadi in the year 1945. A local farmer, while digging for fertilizer, discovered a ceramic jar buried in the ground. Inside were papyrus texts, Gnostic writings that spoke of hidden enlightenment and alternative perspectives on Jesus. Among them was one heavily damaged document deemed too anomalous to categorize. Its first line referred not to a conventional creation or salvation, but to an act of rebellion. The pages described a sound that came down in utter silence, a radiant entity who did not simply fall from grace, but willingly left heaven, seeking true independence. He challenged the established order of creation. He instructed his disciples not to engage in worship, but to persistently question. And he spoke of a separate kingdom, not underneath, but existing alongside the world as we know it. The manuscript was unlike anything historians had previously seen. When a copy of the text reached Rome, it was instantly confiscated and sealed away. The Church officially condemned it as heresy and erased it from all public documentation. But one cardinal, Father Alessandro Verratti, found himself unable to abandon the material. He believed the book predated every other gospel in the Bible and was profoundly more hazardous, not because it denied Christ, but because it depicted Lucifer as a liberator, not an agent of evil. Verratti dedicated years to secretly studying the text. His personal notes, now missing, reportedly claimed the manuscript was composed in a form of early Syriac combined with Aramaic. He theorized it originated with an early group of mystics who viewed the term Satan not as a literal name, but as a conceptual symbol, a deliberate challenger to supreme authority, a divine catalyst for constant questioning. Then, in 1962, Verratti disappeared entirely. The Vatican officially termed it an extended sabbatical. However, a visiting academic later found Verratti's flat completely cleared out, all his research obliterated, with only a single page left behind. On it was a translated sentence from the mysterious Gospel. It read, "The brightest light casts the longest shadow." Some speculate the original text still resides deep inside the Vatican archive, unread and untouched. Others are convinced it was thoroughly destroyed. But certain library curators speak privately of a small box marked only by a red wax seal, which is never to be moved or opened. Whether based in fact or pure legend, the Gospel of Satan remains one of the Church's deepest secrets, not because it is inherently evil, but because it dares to present a narrative where the classic villain is given the first word, and in a global structure founded on sacred, unquestioning silence, that may be the most perilous story of all. In the tunnels running beneath Vatican City, there are secret passages that cannot be found on any published map. Some descend into ancient burial chambers, others to neglected archives. But according to one missing archaeologist, there is one deep chamber so effectively concealed that only 3 people currently alive know the way to access it. And within that chamber, he maintained, rests one of the most powerful sacred objects in all of human history, the Ark of the Covenant. The Vatican has consistently refused to acknowledge this persistent rumour. To even discuss it would inevitably invite impossible, demanding questions. Yet, the whispers persist through the ages, following the same core story, that the Ark, the sacred wooden chest constructed to contain the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, was not lost forever. Instead, it was taken, intentionally hidden, and preserved directly beneath the spiritual centre of the Catholic world. The archaeologist's name was Father Domenico Araldi, a dedicated Jesuit scholar with a profound fascination for biblical history. In 1959, he received special dispensation to conduct a private excavation directly beneath the Vatican gardens. Officially, his work was focused on locating early Christian burial sites. However, his private notes, discovered after his own vanishing, reveal a very different objective. According to his personal journals, Araldi was meticulously following an old Templar-era map. It guided him not to Jerusalem, but to Rome, and to a massive sealed stone entrance beneath the city. He wrote of strange inscriptions etched in Hebrew, Latin, and a third unknown language. Behind that securely closed door, he believed something profound was hidden. He never submitted a formal report after the fall of the Second Temple. One entry from his journal, dated May 1961, described what he believed he had discovered: a wooden structure blackened by extreme age, lined with gold, and supported by 2 solid iron-carrying poles. He wrote, "I did not touch it. I could not. The air around it was humming." That was his final journal entry. 2 weeks later, Father Araldi was gone. The Vatican issued a short, simple press release that a sudden illness had required his immediate early retirement, but no one ever saw him again. Years later, a Vatican archivist named Brother Luca Rossi quietly verified that Araldi's deep excavation site had been permanently sealed and closed. When pressed on whether anything had been found, his only reply was, "The silence speaks for itself." But why would the Church go to such lengths to conceal an artifact as sacred as the Ark? Some believe its presence is too immense, too potentially destabilizing. If its authenticity were ever proven, it could radically shift the foundations of faith, history, and institutional authority in ways no pope could possibly manage. Others suggest it was hidden for protection, not from the world, but from the powerful individuals who would inevitably exploit it for their own gain. And so, the story exists only in the dark shadows beneath the cobblestones of Vatican City. Deeper than any tourist will ever descend may rest the very object that once parted seas and levelled city walls. An artifact not of easy myth, but of deep mystery. And if it is truly there, undisturbed and waiting, the ultimate question remains: who ultimately decided the global community was not yet worthy to see it again? There is a marble basin located in the Vatican Gardens that most visitors walk right past without a second glance. It sits quietly among manicured hedges and precise flower beds, its rim smoothed by centuries of weather, but underneath its polished, calm exterior lies a shocking secret that once horrified the Roman Empire and now subtly links ancient emperors to modern popes, connecting terrible violence to profound holiness. They call it the Bath of Nero. The disturbing story begins in the 1st century, when Emperor Nero governed Rome with both extreme cruelty and dramatic public spectacle. His private palace, the Domus Aurea, was filled with gold waterfalls and rooms designed for elaborate excess. Among his many luxuries was a massive bath, painstakingly carved from a single block of red porphyry, an exceptionally rare stone sourced only from the Egyptian desert. This stone, harder than granite and once reserved exclusively for imperial use, meant this bath was much more than a place for washing. It was a potent symbol of his absolute power, a place where Nero conducted secret high-level meetings, quietly conspired with powerful senators, and hosted private guests in unsettling rituals few ever dared to mention. It was widely rumoured that the blood of his victims was washed from its walls, and that water poured from silver spouts shaped like wolves' heads. No person could enter the inner sanctum of the bath without a direct invitation, or without suffering severe consequences. After Nero's violent death, his palace was intentionally buried under tons of earth and concrete. Later emperors made every effort to erase his very memory. The bath entirely disappeared from sight, presumed either destroyed or broken up for smaller pieces. But it was not. In the early 1500s, during the initial construction of St. Peter's Basilica, labourers excavating the foundations unearthed something highly unusual. A colossal basin, 12 feet in length, half submerged in the deep soil. The quality of the stone was instantly recognisable, deep red, cold to the touch, and too heavy to be moved by human strength alone. It was immediately identified, not as a simple bathtub, but as a chilling relic belonging to Rome's most infamous emperor. Pope Julius II quickly ordered that it be permanently removed from sight, but one ambitious architect, a man named Bramante, successfully convinced him otherwise. He viewed the basin not as a cursed object, but as a powerful, enduring symbol of Rome's ultimate transition from a pagan empire to the centre of the Christian faith. And so, the basin was deliberately relocated to the Vatican gardens, where it was filled with pure water placed among fragrant rose bushes and then allowed to be forgotten. Yet in 1972, an observant art historian named Carla Vanni noticed something peculiar. While working on a minor restoration project, she discovered clear, precise grooves lining the inside of the basin. They were not ornamental, but functional. They aligned like specialized channels explicitly built to guide water, or perhaps something else entirely. Beneath the basin, she found a drainage system unlike any other in the Vatican. Where it led, no one could possibly say. Her detailed findings were quickly and quietly removed from the official record. Some insiders believe the Vatican possesses exact knowledge of the bath's original, brutal purpose. They believe that beneath its current, calm waters once violently swirled a history of ritualistic murder, dark ceremony, and absolute power. Others maintain it is simply an old stone basin, entirely devoid of current significance. But every evening, as the moonlight softly touches the deep red edges of the stone, the garden falls completely silent, and the inescapable past, like still water in a dark pool, patiently waits for its moment to be stirred. In the very heart of the Vatican, among all the overwhelming gold and marble, one of the most ancient and subtle symbols of ultimate power is not a crown or a ceremonial staff, but a modest pair of red leather shoes. For centuries the Pope wore them without fail. Soft, fine leather, hand-stitched with care, dyed the intense colour of human blood. These were never ordinary shoes, and they were emphatically not selected for simple comfort. They were chosen carefully for what they represented, and for the dangerous truth they were designed to obscure. The red shoes are conventionally said to symbolise the blood of Christian martyrs, a powerful emblem of sacrifice and profound humility. However, within the guarded, private halls of the Vatican, some maintain the colour has a far deeper significance, one intrinsically linked to pre-Christian rituals, forgotten royal lineages, and a specific oath sworn long before the arrival of Christianity in Rome. When Pope Benedict XVI publicly wore the red shoes, many casually dismissed it as merely a return to historical tradition. But inside the secretive papal apartments, it awakened something far older, a practice that had remained dormant for nearly a generation. The ritual of the red shoes, according to top-secret Vatican documents dating from the 17th century, was a mandatory component of the coronation ceremony, once performed before every new pope officially took office. In this solemn ritual, the pope would walk barefoot across a long, narrow carpet woven from silk and ashes, surrounded by heavy, burning incense. At the end of this path, he would stand directly before an extremely ancient book, not the conventional Bible, but a specific codex kept hidden in the archive and opened only for this precise occasion. He would then place his bare foot upon a specific line of text written in both Latin and Aramaic and proceed to swear an unbreakable oath never to reveal the contents of what he had just read there. No individual outside the highly controlled ritual ever witnessed that page. In the late 1900s, this entire ceremony was officially discontinued. It was deemed archaic, perhaps even embarrassingly superstitious. But some people strongly believe the actual reason it ended was directly linked to the actions of one specific pope who refused to participate. That man was Pope John Paul I. In his incredibly brief 33-day papacy, he explicitly declined to wear the traditional red shoes, instead requesting plain brown leather ones. Some interpreted this as a sign of his deep humility. Others whispered that he had deliberately refused the ancient ritual, and by doing so had broken a vital chain of tradition. Less than 5 weeks later, he was dead. No official autopsy was ever performed. His personal private notes were immediately seized by high-ranking Vatican officials, and his shoes, the powerful red ones, were never recovered. When Pope Benedict XVI reintroduced them, he did so quietly and without explanation. He never publicly discussed their deeper meaning. But on his final day before his retirement, one photograph captured him walking completely alone in the garden, his red shoes sinking gently into the lush green grass. Some believe he had read the secret text. Others are convinced he chose to resign before the hidden knowledge could also claim his life. Today, the red shoes remain stored in a simple drawer. The current pope has chosen not to wear them, and the ritual, whatever its original purpose, now sleeps beneath countless layers of history. But within, in the quiet, guarded chambers of the Vatican, the colour red still carries significant weight. Not merely the memory of blood, but the memory of a secret. And some memories absolutely refuse to be permanently buried. Beneath the towering, vaulted ceilings of the Vatican museums, placed carefully behind thick glass enclosures and highly polished marble floors, lies one of the most perplexing exhibition spaces in the entire complex, the Gregorian Egyptian Museum. Among its numerous ancient artifacts are statues, canopic burial jars, and a comprehensive collection of genuine Egyptian mummies that have quietly drawn scholarly interest for over a century. However, in the late 1980s, a surprising discovery was made that profoundly rattled the confidence of the expert curators and ignited a Vatican mystery that remains completely unresolved today. The major problem began with one particular mummy. It had been on display for many decades, officially labelled as a noblewoman from the 13th dynasty. Wrapped in severely faded linen, with her original golden mask fully intact, she was a recurring favourite among visitors, a clear connection between Rome and the ancient, deep sands of the Nile Valley. But when a specially assembled team of restorers was brought in to examine the entire collection for necessary long-term preservation, they noticed a critical anomaly. The linen bandages did not match the historical period they were supposedly from. The linen fabric appeared far too modern. They conducted a test quickly, quietly, and with zero public announcement. The resulting data was truly shocking. The linen wrappings were less than 200 years old. Far from being genuinely ancient, they had been recently manufactured sometime in the early 19th century. The mummy was not thousands of years old. She was, at absolute best, 2 centuries old. Even worse, she was definitively not Egyptian. Her body, upon further detailed study, showed clear markers of European bone structure, with no trace of the typical burial resin or ancient embalming practices. She had been expertly wrapped to convincingly appear ancient, but every single scientific test proved otherwise. A complete forgery. The Vatican immediately ordered an intensive, internal review of every mummy in the collection. Over the subsequent 2 years, many more disturbing inconsistencies were uncovered. One mummy was missing its heart, despite being officially labelled as perfectly preserved. Another bore undeniable signs of modern dental work. A third, initially identified as a priest of Anubis, was later revealed to be the body of a child from 19th century Italy. Someone had fabricated these artifacts. But who was responsible? And for what reason? A discreet investigation eventually traced many of the questionable pieces back to a single private donation made in the year 1928. The donor was a wealthy Italian collector named Marco Bellini, who falsely claimed he had acquired the artifacts during an extensive journey through Egypt. However, historical records clearly demonstrate that Bellini never once left Europe. His personal letters, which are still held within the Vatican archive, suggest he was collaborating with a no-art dealer, famous for forging ancient relics by using contemporary corpses stolen from nearby crypts and morgues. The ensuing scandal was never publicly disclosed. To this day, the Vatican museums continue to display several of their Egyptian mummies. Some have been scientifically confirmed as authentic. Others remain officially uncertain. The Church has never officially admitted precisely how many were fakes, nor exactly where the human bodies truly originated. And late at night, when the museum halls are entirely silent, there is one particular glass case that is always carefully draped with a cover during cleaning. The accompanying plaque claims she was a high priestess, but her painted golden eyes appear too wide, too unsettlingly aware, as though she knows perfectly well that she was never intended to be there in the first place. There is a serene old statue in a quiet church in the south of Italy, her surface worn smooth by the devotional touch of countless generations. At her feet, small candles softly flicker. Letters containing fervent requests are reverently folded and placed beside her robes. People gently whisper their prayers into the calm air, absolutely convinced that she can hear their pleas. Her widely revered name is Saint Philomena, but according to highly confidential Vatican records, Philomena may not have actually existed at all. Her legend begins not with a divine miracle, but with a surprising archaeological error. In the year 1802, workers systematically cleaning out the ancient catacombs of Priscilla uncovered a small, previously unknown tomb. Inside, they found human bones wrapped in severely decayed cloth, along with a terracotta tile bearing the single name Philomena. Scrawled in rough red paint was a message loosely interpreted as "Peace be with you, Philomena." The tomb contained no other identifying marks, no records of her life, and no traditional symbols of martyrdom, just profound, unexplained silence. But something about the discovery deeply captivated the imagination of a local priest named Francesco de Lucia. He took the bones back to his parish in the town of Mugnano del Cardinale, where he promptly declared the girl to be an early heroic Christian martyr. Detailed stories quickly began to circulate, that she had been a Roman noblewoman, that she had bravely refused to marry a powerful emperor, and that she was executed for remaining steadfast in her faith. None of these elaborate claims were ever recorded during her alleged lifetime. The dramatic tales instead originated from visions and vivid dreams experienced by a cloistered nun in Naples nearly 20 years later. She claimed that Philomena personally spoke to her in her sleep, revealing the complete story of her life. The Church, moved by the sheer intensity of local popular devotion, officially canonized Philomena in the year 1837, Miracles were quickly reported. Sickly children were suddenly healed. A woman's virulent cancer vanished after merely touching a fragment of the saint's clothing. Her devotional cult expanded rapidly. Shrines were constructed throughout the region. Pilgrims arrived by the thousands. But in the mid-20th century, the Vatican quietly began to raise serious questions. Scientific analyses of the venerated bones revealed deeply troubling results. The entire skeleton was incomplete. Some of the bones belonged to a young girl. Others clearly came from an individual of a much older age. The skull may have belonged to someone else entirely. Even the central name was called into question. Scholars debated whether the tiles had been properly arranged. One expert suggested the name might not be Philomena at all, but merely a confusing jumble of meaningless letters. By 1961, the Vatican officially removed her from the universal liturgical calendar of saints. Her feast day was quietly and quickly dropped. No formal explanation was ever provided. But to countless observers, it was a clear admission. Saint Philomena may never have actually lived. Her sainthood, born purely of fervent local faith and spiritual dreams, possessed absolutely no historical, verifiable foundation. The Church never fully took back her official title for Philomena. To have done so would have cast doubt on every miracle associated with her, every hopeful prayer, every candle lit by people believing someone heard them. Because of this, statues of Philomena still stand in churches throughout Europe and beyond. Her eyes are lowered and her hands are clasped. In a quiet way, she remains a lasting symbol of spiritual comfort to the faithful. Even though her name was once just writing on a neglected tomb in the Vatican, her official case file stays closed. She is a saint created not by recorded events, but by human conviction. Sometimes, belief is the deeper puzzle. In the fall of 1939, a man in white stood on the edge of a world descending into darkness. His name was Eugenio Pacelli, a name history would change to Pope Pius XV. Chosen at the beginning of the Second World War, his time as Pope began not with public declaration, but with silence. This silence would become one of the most disputed mysteries the Vatican has ever held. As the conflict spread across Europe and the Nazi power grew, with terror and might, the world looked to the Vatican for a moral voice, yet the Church kept quiet. While bombs dropped and trains carried people toward horrifying destinations, the voice of Rome offered only soft murmurs. To many observers, it felt like a complete failure. But behind the marble walls of the Vatican, a much more complicated situation was developing. Pius V had previously been the Vatican's ambassador to Germany. He understood its language, its government, and its dangers. When Hitler gained authority, Pacelli was already paying close attention. Some think he saw the complete disaster coming that others could not. Instead of publicly speaking out, he made preparations. Records found in the Vatican archives tell a subtle story. In the war's initial years, confidential meetings took place between Vatican officials and German representatives. These discussions were never recorded in official papers. They left no public trail. However, private correspondence among bishops suggests the Church made a quiet agreement. In return for safeguarding Catholic buildings in Germany and occupied lands, the Vatican would remain officially neutral. This choice deeply divided the Church's conscience. On one side were leaders who felt silence was the only way to prevent the Church from being destroyed. On the other were those who pleaded with the Pope to speak, to condemn the horrors, to clearly identify the evil. Pius V chose to operate in secrecy, but not all secrets stay hidden. In 2020, the Vatican finally opened its wartime archives. Inside were letters from Jewish community leaders thanking the Pope for covert acts of rescue. There were records of priests who falsified baptism certificates to protect families and lists of convents that sheltered children under new identities. Behind the public silence, an underground operation had been active. Still, critics continue to ask, why not speak up sooner? Why not address the situation directly? The answer might be found in a letter written by Pius himself in 1942, a letter that was never sent. In it, he detailed the horror of the prison camps, the suffering he could not ignore, and the concern that a public denunciation would worsen things, not improve them, believing the Nazi retaliation would be brutal and swift. The letter was found tucked away in his personal journal, marked only with a single Latin phrase. Sometimes silence is the loudest cry. Even today, historians debate his actions. Was it a lack of courage? Was it a deliberate strategy? Or was it a more painful reality? The burden of witnessing evil while knowing that words alone were powerless to stop it. Ultimately, the quiet of Pius XIII remains one of the Vatican's most profound and perhaps most disturbing secrets. During the darkest period of the Second World War, as trains moved through the night and families vanished without a sound, a confidential roster began to form within the Vatican. It was not recorded on expensive paper or secured with official stamps. It was hurriedly written, concealed in desks, and passed along in hushed tones through the corridors. The list contained names, the names of those who were saved. Rome had become a city of danger. Beneath its ancient religious beauty, the streets were risky. Nazi soldiers patrolled the outskirts of the capital. Curfews changed every lantern-lit window into a warning. For thousands of Jewish men, women and children, there was nowhere left to seek refuge. Yet within the Vatican, behind the massive walls and elaborate halls, doors opened softly. Monasteries and convents throughout Italy began taking in those seeking shelter. Sometimes a child would arrive with only a name stitched into their clothing. Other times entire families were hidden in cellars or behind concealed walls in libraries. Many were disguised as religious staff or household help. They were given new clothing, new names, and, for a while, a fragile sense of security. The Vatican never officially acknowledged organising these rescue efforts. However, recently uncovered letters from the Vatican files suggest a system more organised than previously understood. There was a primary list, carefully protected, written by hand and circulated among trusted priests. This was the record of the saved. It included those sheltered in religious places, as well as those given forged documents to leave Italy entirely. The woman who initially organised much of this list was a nun named Sister Pascalina. She was the personal assistant to Pope Pius XIV and was seldom seen in public, but her handwriting appears on numerous notes, always in the margins, always in a special code. Her function was discreet but essential. She knew which convents had space, which bishops could be relied upon, and which local officials could be convinced with payment. But the story takes an unsettling turn. In 1944, a Vatican guard was arrested by German troops. In his uniform pocket, they discovered a portion of the list. 14 names, all children. The Germans demanded answers. They asked the Vatican to identify who was helping these families, where they were being concealed, and how they were being moved. The Vatican responded with total silence. The very next evening, a fire erupted at the convent of Santa Maria della Rose. The building was consumed by fire quickly, but all 21 hidden refugees managed to escape through an underground passage. The fire, many believe, was not an accident, but a clear warning. Someone had given away the list's location. And yet, the operation continued. By the close of the war, over 4,000 people had been sheltered through this quiet network. Some never learned the identity of their helpers. Others spent their lives searching for the names of the priests and nuns who risked everything to keep them alive. The complete original list has never been recovered. Some say it was buried with Sister Pascalina. Others suggest it remains somewhere, hidden between books in the Vatican Library. Its ink may have faded, but its profound promise remains unbroken. It is a secret document of quiet bravery and survival. When the war concluded in 1945, the world expected accountability. Cities had been reduced to rubble, Millions had been killed, and the individuals responsible for the destruction were being pursued. Nazi leaders scattered like dust in the wind, many of them disappearing in the confusion. Some disappeared into the vast German forests, others crossed borders and vanished. But the most baffling vanishings pointed to a single location, the Vatican. They called it the Rat Line, a hidden path for those who committed war crimes, secretly moved through churches and religious houses across Europe. At the heart of this covert network was the city of Rome, and even more discreetly the inner core of the Vatican itself. It began with fake documents. In the years following the war, Red Cross identification papers were being distributed to refugees, most of them desperate people left without homes or countries. But somehow, high-ranking Nazi figures were also receiving these papers. Men like Adolf Eichmann and Klaus Barbie, men responsible for horrifying acts, suddenly appeared in Argentina, Syria, and Spain carrying documents authenticated by trusted religious figures. Later investigations would trace many of these false identities back to monasteries with Vatican connections. These were not simply bureaucratic mistakes. Someone was actively helping these men disappear. A Croatian priest named Krunoslav Draganović became a key figure. Officially, he held a position at the Pontifical College of St. Jerome in Rome, but in reality he assisted hundreds of Nazi officers in escaping Europe. He organized hiding places, safe transportation, and even religious blessings for their journey. To some, he was a patriot and a hero to his people. To others, he was someone who undermined justice. The Vatican claimed total unawareness, but hidden in the Vatican archives there are letters from bishops in Austria and Italy asking for religious assistance for unnamed soldiers. There are handwritten notes in the margins about men with complicated pasts who needed immediate relocation. And there is one document signed by a high-ranking Vatican official which simply states, "Protect the faithful, regardless of their past." Was this true compassion, or was it quiet involvement? One significant revelation occurred in 1947 when a journalist found a quiet residence in Rome housing several German officers using false names. He confronted a Vatican spokesperson who responded, "We are a church of forgiveness. Even sinners have a spirit to save." It was not a denial. Decades later, survivors and historians continue to question, why did the Vatican help some of the world's most wanted criminals? Was it fear of the spread of communism? Was it an obligation from deals made during the war? Or was it a more fundamental religious belief that spiritual forgiveness, even for the worst of people, must be offered before any earthly punishment? The total number of people who escaped through the Rat Line remains unknown. Some names are still redacted from the records, some files were never made public. And in a silent monastery on the edge of Vatican City, there is still an empty room where men once waited quietly for the night train to the south. They left without any record, and Rome never mentioned it again. In the summer of 1978, Rome felt the pressure of deep expectation. Pope Paul VI had passed away. Cardinals from all over the globe streamed into Vatican City, their red robes moving through the stone halls, their hushed conversations sounding like old ghosts. Among them was one man who seemed out of place, yet nearly altered the entire direction of church history. His name was Cardinal John Cody of Chicago. It was a time when many felt the Vatican was ready for something entirely new. The Cold War was escalating. Conflicts between the Soviet bloc and the Western world were growing. The United States, with its global reach and large, growing Catholic population, appeared to be more important than ever to the Church's future. Behind closed doors, a subtle idea began to circulate. What if the next pope did not come from Europe, but from the United States? Cardinal Cody was not a well-known figure outside of North America. He was complex, highly engaging, and extremely well-connected. He had close relationships with American intelligence personnel, wealthy contributors, and even government figures. His progression within the church hierarchy had been rapid. Some suggested it was too fast, and he was not without detractors. Then a strange sequence of events took place. In the days before the secret papal election, Vatican staff noticed unusual activity. A number of unmarked vehicles entered and departed a secluded entrance of the Apostolic Palace. A visiting American bishop was observed holding private meetings with powerful cardinals in the manicured gardens, and according to one former Swiss guard, a telephone line from a nearby foreign embassy had been illegally connected to a Vatican residence. Some people believe that more than just hope was driving Cardinal Cody's candidacy, but influence, American influence. Intelligence organizations concerned about Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe may have quietly supported a pope who shared their political views. It was not the first time global politics had played a part in the papal selection process. But Cody was never elected pope. Instead, Albino Luciani of Venice was chosen, the kind man who would become Pope John Paul I. He was famous for his warm smile, his modest nature, and his sudden mysterious death just 33 days later. Some continue to wonder if that decision caused more than just a break in tradition. Did it derail a carefully made plan? After Luciani's passing, a new election was called. This time the world welcomed Pope John Paul II, the first non-Italian in over 4 centuries. But he still was not the American many had anticipated. As for Cardinal Cody, his career declined amid allegations. Accusations of financial corruption followed him. Files disappeared. Witnesses fell silent. By the time of his death in 1982, he was no longer a major figure, but a mere forgotten rumour. The Vatican has never confirmed any plan to elect an American pope. No concrete documents have ever been found. And yet, within the archives, there are notes about confidential meetings, veiled mentions of foreign support, and one sentence scribbled on the edge of an election report. The eagle watches, but will not land. Whether that eagle represented Cody or a greater national ambition, we may never fully know. But for a short time, the papacy almost shifted its centre of gravity to the west, and the story of the American Pope, who was never chosen, became just another Vatican secret kept behind old marble walls. On the evening of May 4th, 1998, the bells of Vatican City rang as they always did, marking evening prayer and the close of another peaceful day. But inside a small building merely steps from the Apostolic Palace, a tragedy had occurred. The air was heavy, the stone hallways silent, and 3 people were dead. The bodies were discovered near the residence of the Swiss Guard. One was Alois Estermann, the newly appointed commander of the Vatican's elite security force. Beside him were his wife and the young guard who had supposedly shot them both before taking his own life. The official explanation was immediate, definite, and conclusive. A personal conflict fueled by intense rage had ended in a sudden disaster. But even as the Vatican released its official statement, doubts began to emerge like dark smoke. Estermann had only been in his new position for a few hours. After years of dedicated service to the Vatican, Estermann had finally been promoted to commander, a highly respected title, particularly for someone not from the customary noble families. Some insiders suggested he had made enemies not only within the Guard itself, but also among influential clergy who resented his increasing power. The young guardsman blamed for the murders was named Cédric Tournay. He was 23, reserved, deeply religious, and from a prominent Swiss family. The Vatican claimed he was mentally unstable, that he had a record of disciplinary issues, and that he had acted out of anger after being denied a promotion. But Tournay's mother would later reveal that her son had written a letter just days before the killings, a letter that mysteriously vanished after the event. When his body was returned to Switzerland, an autopsy revealed something unexpected. Tournay had a gunshot wound to the head, but also evidence of a second severe impact to the skull. The Vatican maintained it was a suicide, but others remained unconvinced. Then came an unexpected twist. A former intelligence agent from France claimed that Esterman had previously worked with international security groups. He suggested the commander had possession of files linking Vatican figures to secret deals made during the Cold War. Documents, he alleged, that someone may have desperately wanted destroyed. The Vatican denied all claims. No such files were ever found. No further investigation was permitted, and the entire case was officially closed in under a week. But in the years that have followed, rumours of a conspiracy have only grown more insistent. Was it truly a crime driven by emotion, or was it something far more premeditated? Was the young guardsman merely a convenient scapegoat, or a witness who was permanently silenced? And what exactly did Commander Esterman know, and perhaps intend to reveal, on the very day he received his promotion? The Swiss Guard has dedicated itself to protecting the Pope for more than 500 years. Their fierce loyalty is legendary. But on that spring night in 1998, one of their own became the focus of one of the most disturbing mysteries in recent Vatican history. A secret completely hidden behind stone and never spoken of again. As German military forces moved across Europe and bombs fell on cities from London to Warsaw, Vatican City remained an untouched sanctuary, protected behind its formidable walls, where the war felt far away. But beneath the decorative floors and large stone courtyards, a shift was taking place. A complex network of tunnels hidden for centuries was suddenly being used again. The Vatican had utilised underground routes for a long time. Some tunnels dated back to the time of ancient Rome, narrow passages designed for escape or discreet movement between various buildings. But during the Second World War, these tunnels were given a new, secret purpose. The Church would later claim they were used for safety, but others believed they were utilised for protecting secrets that could not survive exposure to daylight. In 1943, when the political situation in Italy collapsed and German forces took control of Rome, Pope Pius V faced an impossible decision: speak out publicly against the Nazi government and risk violent retaliation, or safeguard the spiritual heart of the city by keeping his silence. He chose the path of public silence. But inside the tunnels, operations were very different. Those seeking refuge were hidden in the ancient catacombs. Priests exchanged coded messages in the pervasive darkness. Some claim that weapons were smuggled through the passages, although the Vatican has never confirmed this to be true. There is even a persisting story of a Jewish family who survived for 2 years inside a hidden chamber located directly beneath the Apostolic Palace. Their true names were never recorded and their story was never made public. But one Swiss guard, late in his life, swore that he brought them bread by the light of a candle every single night. In the spring of 1944, as the Allied forces closed in on Rome, something else noteworthy occurred. A German officer named Karl Haas claimed he followed a group of Vatican clergy through a cramped tunnel beneath the city. He alleged it led to a sealed room filled with wooden crates, all bearing a wax seal with the papal emblem. Haas was convinced those crates contained important documents, sacred artifacts, or possibly something more crucial: large sums of money. He was discovered spying and quickly transferred. His intelligence file vanished. Following the war, Allied military officers requested permission to inspect the tunnels. The Vatican declined. A number of years later, a small stretch of the underground passage was made accessible to historians. However, many sections stay sealed, blocked, or collapsed with no clear explanation. No maps are on record. No official guide knows the full pathway. And the people who served in them during the conflict are mostly deceased. A fresh development emerged in 2007 when restoration workers in an antique chapel found a flight of stairs that seemingly went nowhere. At the bottom, concealed by a hidden wall, was a tunnel that had been undisturbed for decades. Inside, they found empty racks, a simple bed, and a worn map of Rome with markings in pencil. Even now, no one knows who rested there. The Vatican tunnels are more than just stone structures. They function as pathways of secrecy, routes for both devotion and dread. In a period when finding the truth was dangerous, they quietly protected secrets. And somewhere beneath the capital city, their darkness remains, concealed, silent, observing Rome. The summer of 1983 in Rome was stifling with heat and silent tension. On June the 22nd, a girl, 15-year-old Emanuela Orlandi, finished her music instruction at the Pontifical Institute in Vatican City. She was the child of a Vatican worker, having been born and raised inside the walls of the Holy See. She never returned home. Initially, the case appeared straightforward. A young woman, perhaps overwhelmed, maybe afraid or upset, had run off. But within days, it became evident this was an unusual disappearance. The Vatican released a vague remark, then complete silence. And then, the telephone calls started. A man with an unusual inflection contacted the Orlandi family. He claimed Emanuela was alive, being held to force a deal. He demanded the freedom of Mehmet Ali Agca, the man who attempted to murder Pope John Paul II just 2 years before. The request was strange, and many thought it was a fabrication. But the person on the line knew specifics about Emanuela that no stranger should have. He described her attire, her flute, her last conversation with a friend. That was the initial mystery. Then came a second. A known figure in the Banda della Magliana, Rome's most powerful crime organization, suggested that Emanuela was abducted over debts owed by the Vatican Bank. He stated she was used as a threat, a signal to those within the walls who thought they were above the law. That account too was never verified, and the individual who gave it vanished shortly after. Years went by. The Orlandi family appealed for help. They stood in St. Peter's Square holding photographs of their daughter. Every pope since that event has been questioned about Emanuela. Every response has been identical. Sympathy, prayer, but no definitive answers. Then, after decades, a new piece of evidence, a letter sent anonymously to a reporter, pointed to a burial site in the Teutonic Cemetery just inside the Vatican. 2 19th-century princesses were interred there, but the letter claimed Emanuela was also present. In 2019, the Vatican permitted the grave to be opened, but what they discovered was even more bizarre. The remains of the princesses were gone. The tombs were empty. To this day, no one knows what became of Emanuela Orlandi. Was she a casualty of political pressure? Caught up in a struggle between power and silence? Or was she simply an unfortunate girl in the wrong circumstance? Her name continues to echo through the Vatican's corridors. In recent times, more paperwork has surfaced, hinting that someone on the inside knew more than they ever shared. One unsigned and undated letter simply stated she was taken for what she witnessed. What exactly did she see? Perhaps only the masonry knows. And they aren't talking. By the late 1970s, the Vatican Bank, officially named the Institute for the Works of Religion, was no longer merely a place for managing church finances. Concealed behind immaculate stone and protected by secrecy, it had become a shadowy force in world banking. While the public viewed it as a sacred repository, few understood what truly moved through its accounts. The man in charge was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, a tall, broad-shouldered American who spoke plainly and maneuvered politics like a game of chess. He was not a spiritual expert. He was not a liturgical priest. He was, to be precise, a businessman wearing a clerical collar. Under his leadership, the Vatican Bank began directing money into undisclosed accounts, some for missions the church supported, others less pious. One of the bank's key associates was a private financier named Roberto Calvi, known in Italy as God's banker. He served as president of Banco Ambrosiano, a significant Italian financial institution with close ties to the Vatican. Calvi guaranteed income, loyalty, and discretion. In return, the Vatican secretly endorsed hundreds of millions of dollars in hidden loans. But beneath the financial records and formal wear, a darker plot was unfolding. Banco Ambrosiano failed in 1982. Calvi's financial empire collapsed due to widespread fraud and offshore schemes. As investigators began to probe the situation, they uncovered that Vatican funds had been used to finance political factions in South America, weapons sales, and groups connected to criminal networks. It was beyond poor financial oversight. It was an intricate web of deception. Just days following the bank's collapse, Roberto Calvi disappeared. His remains were discovered hanging from London's Blackfriars Bridge, his clothing filled with rocks and cash. The authorities ruled it a suicide, but the facts were inconsistent. His hands were smooth, yet the cord was taut. His briefcase was missing, and the name of the bridge, Blackfriars, fueled rumours that this was a signal from a secretive group. For decades, investigators attempted to expose the whole truth, but the Vatican refused complete cooperation. Marcinkus, still shielded by the Church, was never indicted. He passed away quietly in the United States, never speaking openly about his knowledge. And what about the missing money? Some disappeared completely, some reappeared in foreign holdings, but the entire narrative remains a Vatican enigma. The surprising development occurred when an Italian court later suggested that Calvi's death was not self-inflicted at all. He had been murdered, and not by criminals or competitors, but by individuals closely connected to the highest levels of finance and religion. In the quiet halls of the Vatican, the bank continues its work. Today, its windows shine on the Roman sunlight, but the past lingers inside. Memories of faked signatures, vanished fortunes, and a man who plunged from a bridge carrying the Church's secrets in his pockets. The Vatican Bank was never just a calculation centre. It was an entrance to influence, to secrecy, and perhaps to something more sinister. In the vast labyrinth of Vatican mysteries, one man achieved prominence not through saintliness, but through figures. His name was Monsignor Marcinkus, a bishop with a finance background and a Vatican pass that provided access everywhere. But there was another figure, more elusive, more cryptic. His name was Bernardino Nogara. In the early 1930s, as the world teetered on the brink of economic crisis and conflict, the Vatican faced its own difficulty. For centuries, the Church depended on gifts and property, but the modern world operated on investments, banking, on wealth that moved in silence. Pope Pius X recognised this and made a choice that would permanently alter the Vatican's future. He appointed a non-cleric, not a priest, to manage the Church's wealth. Nogara was reserved, analytical, and brilliant. He reported exclusively to the Pope. His objective, to expand the Vatican's wealth and safeguard its authority. He accomplished both, but at a price that would be hidden for generations. Under his direction, the Vatican invested in shipping, steel production, insurance, and even weapons manufacturing. The Holy See transformed into a financial giant, spanning across Europe. During the rise of fascism, Nogara made deals that critics claim undermined the Church's ethical standing. He invested in corporations tied to Mussolini's government. When questioned about it later, he simply stated, "My duty is to generate wealth for the Church, not to engage in politics." But that was only part of the account. As the Vatican's wealth grew, its financial operations became more covert. Shell companies were established, assets were concealed using false identities, and Nogara, the mastermind, maintained no public record of his own finances. He lived simply, yet he managed billions. After the conflict, rumours began to circulate. Some alleged that certain Vatican investments had profited from arms manufacturing. Others suggested that gold from captured territories in Europe had been handled by the Church. The Vatican, predictably, denied any knowledge. Nogara never spoke to the media. When he passed away in 1958, he took his secrets with him, but not all of them. Years later, concealed documents appeared in Italian repositories. contracts, correspondence, and private memos that revealed how deeply the Vatican's financial activities were intertwined with world events. One private record, never before shown to the public, mentioned a bank transfer to Argentina with the note approved at highest level. The timing was immediately after several prominent Nazis fled Europe. The Vatican has consistently denied these claims, but for those who study church history, Nogara's influence remains like an unsolved case. His investments helped establish the contemporary Vatican. His plans defined its reach, but the consequence, the compromise, the silence, the hidden transactions is still being evaluated. In the eyes of some, he was a genius. In the view of others, a man who prioritized money over faith. And caught between these two views, a puzzle continues to exist, encoded in numbers and hidden in vaults the public may never see. In a quiet section of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, behind a solid wood door that rarely opens, there is a cabinet no one discusses. It is not included on the standard tour. It is not listed in the records available to researchers, yet it is there, and inside are files known only to a few. The Jesuit papers. For generations, the Society of Jesus has been the most obedient, most organised order in the Catholic Church. Established in the 16th century, their mandate was to defend the faith with both intellectual strength and unwavering submission. Over time, the Jesuits became renowned not just for their education but for their discretion. Some even whispered that their superior general, frequently referred to as the Black Pope, wielded an authority more profound than the Pope himself. Most of the documents in the archive are routine letters, reports, lists of missions, and schools. But concealed among them, behind a series of unlabelled folders, was one document that seemed out of place. It was a memo, written by hand in Italian, dated sometime in the initial years of the Cold War, and its contents unnerved the few who have seen it. The document described a meeting held not in Rome but at a private estate near Madrid, where a small council of Jesuit advisors met to discuss a risky proposition. The Church, they believed, was losing ground in the Eastern Bloc. Communism was spreading rapidly. Traditional outreach methods were ineffective. They required a new strategy. The memo outlined a concept. What if the Church could influence political thought not through sermons, but through advanced technology? The Jesuits had connections to scientists, engineers, and intellectuals from across the continent. Some were already experimenting with advanced methods of surveillance, information gathering, and something alarmingly close to psychological manipulation. The objective was not military conflict, it was subtle influence, shaping opinions, preventing rebellion. But what most concerned historians was not the scheme itself, it was the comment scrawled at the bottom, "Approved file under Petrus Protocol." That exact phrase does not appear anywhere else in the history of the Vatican, not publicly, not in official records. Some speculate it referred to a covert project to observe world leaders and secretly direct global decisions. Others believe it was an unsuccessful trial, silently abandoned, but a few are convinced it is still operational. The document was nearly destroyed in the 1970s during a restructuring of the Jesuit archive. A young priest tasked with organising old documents discovered it and secretly made a copy before handing it over. He later resigned from the priesthood and disappeared. His name was Father Luis Romero, and to this day his whereabouts are unknown. The original memo was returned to the cabinet labelled as unimportant, but those who know its content claim it verifies a long-held suspicion that the Vatican's power extends beyond the spiritual realm, that during times of global crisis it might engage in politics, scientific research, and perhaps even the future of human thought itself. What other secrets are buried in the Jesuit papers? We may never discover, but one thing is certain: Not all mysteries are lost accidentally. Some are intentionally concealed. In the summer of 1933, Italy was overshadowed by the increasing threat of fascism. Benito Mussolini governed with an iron fist, and the atmosphere over Rome was carefully monitored. Not for weather or birds, but for something unusual. That June, near the small town of Magenta, just west of Milan, an object fell from the sky. It was not an aircraft. It was not a weather balloon. It was silent, swift, and when it landed, it left a scar in the soil that faintly glowed for several hours. The first accounts came from local farmers. A metallic object shaped like a flattened bell had crashed in a wooded area just outside the community. Within minutes, local law enforcement arrived, followed rapidly by military personnel. The location was secured, and witnesses were ordered to remain silent. But one person did speak, and the story, passed down through whispers over the decades, would eventually reach the archives of both the Italian government and, surprisingly, the Vatican. The crash was categorized by the fascist administration as strictly confidential. Mussolini's troops transported the debris to an airbase near Rome. What they discovered inside the vehicle remains a puzzle, but one comment survives from a private journal kept by a military official at the scene. Non humano, non terrestre, Vaticano informato. Not human, not from Earth. Vatican informed. That final phrase has provoked questions for years. Why was the Vatican notified? And what did the Church do with that specific information? The answer may rest with a single individual, Father Pietro Tacci Venturi. He served as Mussolini's personal Jesuit counselor and had immediate access to the Pope. Documents released much later indicate that Venturi reported the event to the Vatican Secretary of State. Within days, a group of church academics was discreetly sent to examine the wreckage, not as scientists, but as spiritual consultants. Their purpose, according to some researchers, was not to analyse the object, but to assess its religious implications. If it was not from Earth, then what did that imply for religious belief, for Scripture, for the very concept of humankind being created in God's image? The findings of that group were never released to the public. But shortly after they returned to the Vatican, several modifications were made to internal church policy concerning unusual celestial events. A new office was established within the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and the incident was never spoken of again. For decades, the Magenta crash was dismissed as folklore. But in the early 2000s, an Italian journalist uncovered a document hidden in a private collection, a Vatican memo dated 1938. It referenced una macchina del cielo, a machine of the sky, and warned of scientific repercussions beyond our comprehension. The Vatican has never acknowledged its involvement in the Magenta incident, but the questions linger. If the Church did observe something extraterrestrial, did it conceal the truth to safeguard faith? Or because it feared what that truth might signify? And even more disturbing, what if that object was not the only one? High above the quiet avenues of Vatican City, situated beneath the same heavens, observed by religious figures and monarchs, stands an observatory with instruments that are perpetually alert. Its equipment is precise, its records are ancient, and its caretakers wear the robes of both religion and science. Few realise that for centuries the Vatican has studied not only religious texts, but also the night sky. And among those who looked through the lens were popes themselves, secret astronomers, seeking understanding far beyond our planet. It may seem unlikely, the image of a pope leaning over a telescope, charting stars by candlelight. But it happened. In the early 1700s, Pope Clement XIII supported astronomical research as a means to determine religious dates and comprehend the heavens, viewing it not just as a marvel, but as a mechanism created by God. Years later, Pope Leo III would formalise this interest. In 1891, he authorised the construction of the Vatican Observatory to demonstrate that the Church was not opposed to scientific inquiry. But why would a pope be focused on the stars during a period when many still feared what lay beyond them? The answer is rooted in a quiet disagreement, one not between good and evil, but between knowledge and apprehension. As scientific progress continued, so did uncertainty. Was Earth truly the focal point of the universe? Was humanity actually alone? And if the stars contained life distinct from our own, what would that suggest for the story of creation? The Vatican kept observing. Behind secure doors, papal astronomers recorded the movement of unknown lights and studied star charts older than the Church itself. Some popes were merely intrigued. Others, like Pope Pius XII, were profoundly engaged. Pius believed in a harmony between science and scripture, but in private he worried about what modern discovery might reveal. His correspondence, stored deep in the archives, speaks of wonders that challenge the spirit and warns that not all luminous objects in the sky are stars. In the mid-20th century, Vatican astronomers began collaborating quietly with international space organizations. They shared star charts and even documented data from space telescopes. Officially, this was part of a global initiative to understand the cosmos. But unofficially, some believed they were searching for clues, communications, possibly concealed within starlight. Then came a strange incident. In 1993, a Vatican astronomer working in Arizona reportedly observed an unidentified object moving across the sky at an impossible speed. He documented the event, but the file vanished within a few weeks. No explanation was ever provided. When later questioned, the observatory denied the observation. Today, the Vatican still operates its telescopes, continues to chart the stars, and still funds research into galaxies millions of light years distant. The official explanation? To grasp God's creation. But some believe they are watching for something more, something that moves where it should not, or sends signals where there should be stillness. And if the popes of the past found something in the stars, one must wonder, what did they choose not to disclose to us? At the summit of Mount Graham in Arizona, where the atmosphere is crisp and the stars appear close enough to touch, there is a telescope with a name that has stirred both curiosity and apprehension. It is named Lucifer. The name alone has fueled speculation, but the truth behind it is far more unusual than most assume. This instrument is part of a powerful observatory network that includes the Vatican. Indeed, the Vatican has a presence on this mountain, working alongside scientists from around the world. Their stated purpose, they claim, is to study the cosmos, to map distant galaxies, and to gain a greater understanding of God's creation through scientific inquiry. But during the silent hours of the night, when only the machinery buzzes and the desert holds its breath, some believe the Vatican is looking for something else entirely. The name Lucifer is not what most imagine. It is an acronym for a lengthy technical term related to infrared astronomy. But the timing of the name choice, its placement next to a Vatican-affiliated observatory, and the ancient connotations of the word have made many uneasy. After all, Lucifer was once known as the morning star, the light-bearer before his fall. Was this mere chance, or a deliberate hidden message? Some accounts suggest that in the early 2000s, a Vatican astronomer working at Mount Graham witnessed something unusual. It was not a satellite or a passing comet. It did not flicker or radiate light. It hovered, moved against the backdrop of the stars, then vanished without a trace. The report was never made public. The data was erased, and the astronomer, a reserved man named Brother Enzo, abruptly left his position and was never heard from again. Locals near the mountain have long recounted tales of strange aerial lights, but one report is particularly notable. A maintenance worker called in to repair one of the cooling systems late at night claimed to have seen a group of researchers standing silently at the telescope. They were completely still, not speaking, just observing something through the primary lens. When he walked past again 15 minutes later, the room was empty, and dark. No record of those individuals has ever been found. Why would the Vatican be so focused on this specific mountain? Some suggest it is sacred territory to Native American tribes, and that ancient folklore speaks of spirit passageways or beings that inhabit the sky. Others argue that the high elevation and low humidity simply make it ideal for scientific observation. But those who investigate deeper, those who examine the archives and trace the connections, see a pattern of missing reports, deleted observations, and priests who refuse to discuss what they saw. So what precisely is the Vatican observing from Mount Graham? Are they tracking stellar objects or coded transmissions? And if they have witnessed something that shook the convictions of even the most devout among them, why has the world not been informed? Perhaps because some truths are not meant to be brought into the light. In the quiet passageways of the Vatican, behind closed doors that the public never sees, there are narratives that resemble science fiction more than holy tradition. One such account involves a device called the chronovisor, a machine that, if the legends are accurate, possessed the ability to view time itself. The story begins in the years immediately following the Second World War. A Benedictine friar named Father Pellegrino Ernetti, an expert in both early music and religious rituals, asserted he had been involved in a secretive Vatican research effort. With the aid of several brilliant individuals, including a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and members of the Vatican's scientific division, Ernetti claimed they had constructed a mechanism capable of observing the past, not figuratively, but literally. The chronovisor, as he named it, was said to be a type of time screen, a large curved metal frame with a luminous surface attuned to residual vibrations left behind by historical events. According to Ernetti, every occurrence that ever took place left an energetic imprint, like an audible echo, and the chronovisor could gather those echoes and display them visually. Not only could it show events from past centuries, it could capture the spoken words, see the colours, and observe the precise details of history as they unfolded. The most astonishing assertion was when Ernetti stated they had used it to witness the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He even recounted the moment with vivid detail. Years later, a blurred image appeared. A face wearing a crown of thorns, eyes closed, frozen in agony. Ernetti claimed it was taken by the machine. Critics argued it was a deception, a duplicate of an old church statue. The Vatican offered no comment. And yet, in the background, the mystery intensified. A priest close to Ernetti confessed on his deathbed that the machine had indeed existed, but had been dismantled under orders from the church. The justification: they feared what it might disclose. If the actual events of the past were different from the accepted narrative, what would be the effect on faith, on belief, on the very legitimacy of the Vatican itself? There were whispers. The chronovisor was also capable of showing glimpses of the future, not as premonitions, but as actual documented events that had not yet come to pass. That part of the device, according to the rumours, was permanently locked away. In the beginning, skeptics dismissed the entire account as a fantasy. Yet a few strange elements remain. A confidential memo from the 1950s mentions Vatican concern over optical time displacement. A letter from an Italian scientist references a forbidden lens that sees through years. And in the archives, there are heavily censored documents where only the word chrono remains readable. Did the Vatican once possess a window into time? Or was it merely a cautionary tale about the peril of knowing too much? Regardless of the answer, the story of the chronovisor persists in the shadows of history, enticing those who believe that even the past can still be concealed. They say a photograph captures reality in a single moment. But what if the image is older than the technology that recorded it? What if it displays something no human should have ever witnessed? Deep within the Vatican's most closely held secrets lies the narrative of a single disputed picture. a photograph rumoured to show the face of Christ at the moment of his execution. This narrative opens not with a camera recording, but with a complex apparatus, a machine known as the chronovisor. It's a device some believe was built by a group of Vatican priests and scientists during the mid-20th century. If this machine ever genuinely existed, it was supposedly able to attune to the temporal echoes, displaying scenes of the past as if they were live memories. Some quickly dismissed the concept as mere fantasy. Others claimed it was immediately taken apart and then concealed to protect the shocking nature of its findings. One such finding was a solitary image, a small photo that Father Pellegrino Ernetti, a monk said to have been part of the Chronovisor project, displayed just before his passing. The picture appeared to show the face of a man, his eyes shut in intense suffering, a crown of thorns upon his head, tilted in profound, silent pain. Father Ernetti maintained it was a real-time image of Jesus Christ taken during his crucifixion, a live instant extracted from history. The photograph instantly provoked a wave of disbelief. Skeptics quickly pointed out that the image bore a striking resemblance to a sculpture housed in an ancient Italian church. Some suggested it was merely a deception meant to draw attention to Ernetti's sensational claims. Yet others, including certain quiet voices within the Vatican itself, never explicitly denied that the machine was real. The Vatican never offered an official comment on the photograph. It never officially labelled the image a fraud, but what fueled even more suspicion was what happened next. Ernetti died shortly after making the image public, and according to a trusted friend who visited him on his deathbed, he had prepared a sealed letter, one that was immediately confiscated by Vatican officials and has never surfaced since. Some strongly believe the photograph was authentic, that it proved the chronovisor functioned exactly as intended, and that the Vatican feared the widespread disruption it could cause. If history could be observed as easily as a film, what other secrets might be revealed? Who else might be recorded on film? A truth contradicting scripture had the potential to unravel centuries of religious doctrine in an instant. In the years following, other supposed photographs emerged, each claiming to depict the very same suffering face. But none matched the clarity of the original. None came with a direct witness who had actually served in the Vatican's marble halls. None were followed by the same absolute silence that descended after Father Ernetti's last breath. To this day, the photograph remains a true enigma, a piece of visual testimony originating from a machine that might only ever have been a myth. But somewhere, possibly stored deep inside a locked Vatican vault or forgotten in a dusty drawer, the original might still be preserved, a single moment of faith captured in time, waiting to be either accepted or utterly erased, in the subdued ambient light of a private Vatican study room. A priest once mused about the stars, not simply in terms of poetry or sacred texts, but as a realm of pure possibility. His name was Father Corrado Balducci, and he was attired in the robes of a well-respected theologian. But silently, and with extreme caution, he began sharing a conviction that made him completely unique, that humankind was not the sole life in the universe. Father Balducci was not some marginal thinker. He had served as a designated exorcist for the Vatican, an accomplished diplomat of the Church, and a man universally trusted to speak on matters of true spiritual importance. And yet, throughout the final decades of the 20th century, he began making highly careful pronouncements about visitors arriving from other worlds. In formal interviews, academic lectures, and private correspondence, he discussed extraterrestrials not as malevolent demons, but as beings created by God, existing as part of the same divine creation, simply originating from much further away. He was careful not to present this as official church doctrine. The Vatican never formally endorsed his opinions, but they never made an attempt to silence him either. That quiet lack of denial, for some people, felt like a form of consent. Balducci argued that alien existence, should it be proven, would not threaten existing faith. In fact, he claimed, it would only serve to broaden our comprehension of God's immense power. Why would a creator responsible for infinite galaxies choose to fill them only with an absolute void? Why would Earth be the only suitable stage for the sacred? Some insiders privately labelled him as dangerous. A few whispered that his ideas edged perilously close to outright heresy, but others, including a small group of scientists who met him discreetly in Rome, viewed him as a vital intermediary, a man positioned to help prepare the Church for a day that might ultimately come. That day, many people truly believed, had already arrived. By the beginning of the 1990s, reported sightings of unidentified flying objects had captured global attention. Unusual lights were reported by trained pilots, senior military personnel, and even police officers. While most people quickly dismissed the reports, Balducci started compiling various accounts. He was especially interested in those who described peaceful encounters, narratives devoid of fear, containing only simple curiosity. The real shock came when it was heavily rumoured that Balducci had received an invitation to a private meeting within Vatican City with leading astronomers, theoretical physicists, and even representatives from a major European observatory. The main topic, one source alleged, was not simply whether aliens existed, but how the Church should strategically respond if direct contact were finally established. The existence of the meeting was never officially confirmed. Balducci chose not to deny anything, but offered absolutely no specific details. Soon afterward, he deliberately withdrew from the public eye, and when he passed away in the year 2008, his personal papers were quietly and quickly collected by church officials. Some immediately assumed they were destroyed. Others speculate they were simply sealed away like so many delicate secrets that rest in absolute silence beneath the great Vatican dome. Was Balducci merely fantasizing about the distant stars? Or was he actively readying the world for a revelation too massive for a simple pulpit? Somewhere among the silent stars the eventual answer may be waiting, and perhaps someone else is waiting too. In a barely used wing of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, there rests a specific set of ancient scrolls that very few have ever had the chance to examine. Tucked away behind extensive rows of theological writings and brittle letters from long-dead bishops, these scrolls contain something that pertains neither to sacred text nor to law, but to the deep cosmos. They are only recognized by a mysterious name whispered among a select group of archivists, the Celestial Codex. The parchment itself is extremely old, clearly stained with the passage of time, and meticulously painted in a deep blue ink that still offers a faint shimmer under the unsteady light of a candle. Each scroll is completely covered with constellations, massive star clusters, and detailed planetary alignments. At first glance, they look exactly like the diligent work of medieval monks meticulously studying the heavens. But then the precise patterns begin to visibly change, not in the visible sky, but right there on the aged page. A Jesuit astronomer in the late 1600s was the first to notice this striking anomaly. The constellations meticulously drawn on the scrolls did not correspond with any recognized star patterns of his contemporary era. Even more unsettlingly, they did not match the night sky visible above Earth whatsoever. What he discovered were stars that should only have been visible thousands of years in the past. Or, more chillingly, not from Earth, but from an entirely different astronomical perspective. He formally reported his alarming discovery in a private coded letter to the Vatican Observatory, desperately hoping for a simple explanation. What he received in return was complete silence. His special access to the archive was immediately revoked, and the scrolls themselves were completely removed from the official catalogue, but not before he managed to painstakingly copy the intricate maps by hand. Centuries later, in the early 1960s, a young, ambitious researcher unexpectedly rediscovered the copies in an old, forgotten storage vault beneath a historic chapel in Venice. She carefully compared the ancient charts to state-of-the-art astronomical software and arrived at a chilling conclusion. The maps perfectly aligned not with Earth's unique view of the stellar fields, but instead with the exact sky as it would be seen from the planet Mars. She quickly travelled to Rome and formally requested the essential permission to view the original scrolls. Her request was promptly denied. Within a matter of months, her university research funding mysteriously vanished, and her entire academic record was somehow lost in what was officially termed a mere clerical error. The Vatican never offered any response. Some people suggest the maps are remnants of a vast, lost library, possibly gifted to the Church by an advanced ancient civilization, perhaps even one that originated off-world. Others speculate they were produced during powerful spiritual visions or dreams, guided by an intelligence entirely beyond human comprehension. And then there is the third theory, the one most cautiously whispered of all, that the maps were not created by simple monks, but were directly copied from something actually discovered, something secretly delivered to the Vatican a long, long time ago. A sophisticated device, a complex lens, a working machine. No one can definitively say. But the maps currently remain deeply locked away in official silence. Every single dot of ink, each careful, delicate stroke tells an important story, not about Earth, but about another place within God's limitless creation. And perhaps one day, someone will finally manage to trace the exact path carefully concealed among those distant stars and finally figure out where this profound story truly started. High above the scorching Sonoran desert, where the soft wind gently whispers through the native pines and the brilliant night sky shimmers with an impossible density of stars that city dwellers have never witnessed, the Vatican maintains a powerful telescope. Few visitors would expect to suddenly find a key piece of the Holy See complex nestled among the remote peaks of Mount Graham in southern Arizona. Yet, there it stands, quiet and brightly gleaming, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. A decidedly cumbersome name that hides a much deeper, more persistent mystery. Local residents often simply refer to it as the Vatican Observatory. Some, with an elevated eyebrow and a distinct knowing tone, whisper another, more ominous name, the Watchtower. Officially, the Vatican has historically had a long involvement in the field of astronomy. For countless centuries, the Church has been diligently studying the heavens, not in order to chart horoscopes or to search for omens, but in an earnest effort to understand the sheer wonder of God's universal creation. That is the comforting story they reliably present. But here, on a significant mountain once considered sacred by local native tribes and fiercely guarded by passionate environmental groups, the essential question is not merely why the Church chooses to observe the sky, but precisely what it is observing for. In the early 1990s, when the observatory's construction was quietly completed, widespread protests immediately erupted. Environmentalists loudly voiced concerns about critically endangered local species. Tribal elders adamantly claimed the mountain held profound spiritual power. But the Vatican, with financial backing from major American universities, maintained an absolute silence on the facility's deeper intended purpose. And so, the controversial construction proceeded. Inside, the actual telescope is cutting edge, capable of seeing significantly further and clearer than most of its competing models. But in a rather odd and unsettling twist, the most frequently whispered rumour concerned not the telescope itself. It was about a second instrument deliberately housed close by, one with a cryptic name that seemed to deliberately invite relentless questioning. They called it Lucifer. Not in the obvious biblical context, officials quickly explained. It was merely a scientific acronym for an extremely long and complex technical title, they insisted, completely unrelated to the devil. But the provocative name immediately stuck, and with it came various unsettling stories. A former telescope technician once claimed that during some night shifts, priests would regularly arrive and utilize the telescope, for many hours without ever formally logging what they had seen. Specific files were always encrypted, and the detailed logs were mysteriously erased. One specific night, the technician claimed to have seen clear images of an extremely strange object. Not an ordinary comet, not a recognizable star, but something clearly metallic and slowly moving across the deep darkness. When he subsequently asked detailed questions, he was suddenly fired 2 days later. The Vatican offered no public explanation. Father Mario Battellini, an esteemed astronomer and Jesuit priest who spent many years commuting between Rome and Arizona, once hinted in a brief interview that the Church was actively preparing for something significant. The universe, he stated softly, is far more filled with life than we have previously imagined, and God's overarching plan may not have been created for Earth alone. The specific interview was never broadcast again. Perhaps the observatory is absolutely nothing more than what it publicly claims to be, a simple scientific outpost perpetually gazing at distant stars and galaxies. Or perhaps it represents something much greater, a quiet, constant sentinel meticulously searching the vast skies not just for light, but for a distinct signal, a subtle whisper emanating from the deep dark, a profound reminder that even in the utter isolation of the desert, the Vatican keeps its collective eyes wide open. In the absolute stillness of the early dawn, when the vast majority of the world is only just beginning to stir, a small, select group of scholars working within the Vatican begins their daily work, focusing not on scripture, but on the stars. For many centuries, the Vatican has kept a careful eye on the heavens, but in recent decades their primary focus has definitively shifted well beyond ordinary planets and constellations. They are now very quietly studying something far more intrinsically mysterious: other habitable worlds. This significant search did not commence in any public forum. It strictly began behind firmly locked doors in the rarely seen corridors of the Vatican Observatory. Long before most ordinary people had ever even heard the official term exoplanet, the Church was already diligently watching. Priests who were extensively trained in advanced physics and astronomy regularly gathered in silent, anonymous rooms to meticulously examine data streams from powerful telescopes situated all across the globe. They carefully scanned the entire sky for faint flickers of light, minor changes in stellar brightness that could potentially signify another Earth circling a distant star. The core question they were actively asking was remarkably simple: are we truly alone? And, far more importantly, if we are not, what exactly does that major revelation imply for everything the Church currently teaches? One prominent Jesuit priest, Father José Funes, once said something that immediately stirred quiet, intense conversations throughout Rome. The distinct possibility of actual life existing beyond Earth, he gently explained, does not necessarily contradict the Catholic faith. In fact, he suggested, it could possibly expand it. His precise words were clearly and carefully chosen, but their underlying meaning was absolutely clear. The Vatican was not fearful of the concept. It was actively preparing for its eventual arrival. Some sources claim this secret effort became significantly more urgent following the confirmed discovery of specific exoplanets in the early 2000s. A few of these unimaginably distant worlds appeared to possess the precise conditions necessary for sustaining life: water, a breathable atmosphere, and even the necessary heat. Vatican scientists immediately took serious note. Their overwhelming interest was not solely academic, it was deeply spiritual. One specific internal document, which was reportedly circulated exclusively among senior church leaders, hinted at an even deeper, more pressing concern. What if contact is finally established, not in the distant, uncertain future, but actively within our own lifetime? What if someone, somewhere, actively sends a detectable signal back? This was clearly not science fiction. This was serious, actionable preparation. There were intense internal discussions about official doctrine, the concept of universal salvation, and even the logistics of baptism. Could a sentient being arriving from another planet possibly know God? Could it possess an immortal soul? Would it actually require saving? These are decidedly not the typical questions most people would ever expect the Vatican to be asking. But they are. Quietly, meticulously, and always with their collective eyes firmly fixed on the night sky. A distinct turn in the narrative occurred when a dedicated group of Vatican astronomers travelled to South America in the year 2013. Officially, they were there, simply to observe a routine solar event. Unofficially, it was strongly whispered that something extraordinary had been discovered high up in the Andes Mountains. A mysterious symbol intricately carved into an ancient stone, a star map that simply did not correspond to our known sky. The complete report was never formally published. Tonight, the visible stars above may seem absolutely still, silent, and incredibly distant. But deep within the secretive confines of the Vatican, men of both faith and science continue to look upwards, not out of any inherent fear, but out of profound curiosity. Somewhere far out there, the ultimate truth may indeed be waiting. And the Vatican, as it has always done, fully intends to be ready. In the deepest, most shadowed corner of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, far beyond the ordinary parchment scrolls and the officially sealed papal bulls, rests a single shelf that possesses no official name. Archivists only ever refer to it casually, and even when they do, they only speak in hushed whispers. What currently sits there is not a simple book or a fragile manuscript. It is a small, unremarkable wooden case securely locked with a sturdy iron clasp and starkly labelled with a single word that should not logically exist in classical Latin: extraterrestrialis. According to one retired Jesuit who only agreed to speak on the record a single time before completely vanishing from public life. The strange box originated in South America sometime in the late 1970s. A diligent missionary had supposedly stumbled across it high up in the mountains of Peru. It had been carefully buried beneath the ruins of a collapsed stone temple, meticulously wrapped in a thick protective layer of lead, and covered in unique symbols that bore no resemblance to any known native languages. The powerful artifact contained inside, he firmly claimed, was not native to this earth. When it eventually reached Rome, it was not formally catalogued under archaeology or anthropology. It was immediately diverted straight into the private collection of the Vatican Observatory, completely bypassing every standard bureaucratic channel. Only 3 specific people were ever granted permission to examine it: 1 astronomer, 1 theologian, and 1 linguist. The linguist reportedly absolutely refused to ever speak of what he encountered. The theologian, who later suffered a devastating mental breakdown, described the artifact as a cryptic message carefully written in metal. The compelling story might have remained deeply buried like so many others if not for one crucial leak. In the early 2000s, a secretive document suddenly surfaced online. It was scanned, partially damaged, and clearly incomplete, but still remarkably legible. It described a solid object made of completely unknown material, extremely cold to the touch, yet simultaneously emitting faint, low-frequency vibrations. The cautious author, writing in formal Latin, noted that it resembled a tablet or some form of sophisticated device marked with complex grooves resembling writing, but clearly not designed for any human hand. The Vatican never issued a formal response. Some people strongly believe the artifact was deliberately sent to the secret observatory in Arizona for covert testing. Others claim it was returned to the archive, where it now sits carefully concealed behind a false wall, completely unmarked and impossible to trace. And then there are those who vehemently insist it was only one of several such objects. that similar artifacts were simultaneously found in the vast deserts of Egypt, deep within the ice of Antarctica, and even inexplicably beneath the ancient foundations of an old monastery in Romania. What connects all these persistent stories is a single chilling rumour: that the artifacts, despite being physically scattered across continents and centuries, all contain perfectly matching symbols, a specific language, perhaps a grave warning, or quite possibly an actual map. Whether these are simply compelling stories or genuine hidden truths, we currently possess no way of knowing. But what we can definitively confirm is that the Vatican has consistently prepared for events that others actively choose to ignore. And if even a small part of these persistent whispers is true, then the archive holds much more than just forbidden texts and ordinary dusty secrets. It may hold a crucial key, a key not only to understanding the profound past, but to comprehending something vast waiting just beyond the familiar stars. Behind the thick, heavy wooden door situated just off the famous Sistine Chapel lies a small, simple chamber, utterly unassuming in its appearance, but absolutely saturated in silence. It is cryptically called the Room of Tears, and although the public rarely hears its name, every single pope in history has stood inside it completely alone, just moments after formally accepting the incredible weight of the keys to the kingdom of God. It is not designed to be grand or lavishly decorated with gold. The floor is rough-cut stone, the ceiling is conspicuously low. The only visible adornments are 3 plain white garments, sized long in advance, but prepared in absolute secrecy. A simple mirror, a plain wooden bench, and a stark crucifix that has hung on the wall for well over 400 years. Why do popes consistently weep here? Some suggest it is the crushing immediate awareness of their enormous new responsibility. Others quietly whisper it is the final possible moment a man can still technically walk away. One specific pope in the mid-20th century locked himself inside the room for nearly an entire hour. When the concerned attendants finally knocked, worried that he had collapsed, he opened the door with noticeably red eyes and trembling hands. He would later privately confess, "I witnessed more inside that room than I could have ever possibly expected." According to certain Vatican historians, a secret, profound ritual once traditionally took place here, one no longer mentioned in any official records. A personal confession made not to a listening priest, but directly to the church itself. A specific parchment was hidden directly behind the crucifix. The newly elected pope was required to write a single, personal sentence, a deepest fear, a grave sin, a solemn promise, then carefully fold the paper and place it inside a simple wooden drawer that possessed no key. That drawer is now permanently sealed shut. In 1978, when Pope John Paul I solemnly stepped into the Room of Tears, he quickly emerged minutes later, visibly pale and completely silent. 33 days later, he was dead. The official publicised cause was a sudden heart attack, but a nun who found his body reported his hands were tightly clenched and a small piece of paper lay mysteriously beneath the body. The paper was instantly taken and never seen again. Some believe the room itself actively holds a distinct presence, not a common ghost, but something infinitely older. Older than marble, older than Latin. It is a terrifying place where the collective weight of centuries leans in incredibly close, where the deepest secrets of past popes seem to indelibly linger in the air, and where the newest successor to St. Peter must honestly ask himself not what great things will I personally do, but what critical things have they already done before me? Few ordinary people will ever be allowed to step inside the Room of Tears. Fewer still will ever truly understand its absolute silence. But the Vatican does not preserve its spaces without an important reason. And this small, heavily hidden room, though it may be diminutive and tucked away, may in fact be one of the most secretive and powerful chambers in the entire history of the Church. Tonight we linger in this unsettling quiet space, and we openly ask what truly happens behind that closed door when absolutely no one is watching and the tears suddenly begin to fall. The convent was an island of quiet, securely nestled deep within the Umbrian hills. The dedicated nuns rigidly kept to their faithful prayers, their harmonious chants gently rising with the morning mist, and then slowly fading with the absolute hush of twilight. But among the sisters, one could not rest easy. She went by the name of Sister Maria Crocifissa, and in the year 1676 she began insisting she heard cries in the dark, not from the world of the living, but from the lost souls of purgatory. Sister Maria had been respected for her piety, quiet, focused, a woman of few words and endless prayer. However, something fractured within her during Lent that year. She started waking up in the pre-dawn hours, soaked in sweat, struggling for breath. She would speak of voices calling out to her, pleading for help, begging to be released. Some spoke Latin, others used tongues she could not recognize. One evening she collapsed just outside the chapel, her hands seared red. The wood floor underneath her was stained with black residue, as if something had been burned there. Yet there had been no actual fire. When questioned by her confessor, a priest from the main cathedral nearby, she described shadows tearing at her spirit, of people trapped between salvation and damnation, weeping not from pain, but from profound isolation. She claimed she had been shown a space where time had stopped, where the pain of past mistakes was louder than any burning. She also maintained that some of those sorrowful voices belonged to former priests, even to popes. This news travelled beyond the walls of the convent. Vatican officials dispatched a group to look into it. They brought along a noted scholar of demonic influence and a doctor. Sister Maria was examined and determined to be physically healthy, but the scholar, after only 2 nights of observation, departed without giving a reason. He would later resign from his official position. The incident that secured Sister Maria's place in history occurred several weeks later. She entered the chapel alone and emerged holding a rolled-up parchment covered in script. But the writing was not Latin, not Greek, not any known language. The scroll held a chaotic mess of symbols, mystical marks, and reversed letters. She stated it had been dictated to her in the utter quiet of the cries. She warned it was not meant for human inspection. That specific scroll remains preserved in the archives today. Many have attempted to decipher it. Most attempts fail. A code breaker in the 20th century suggested the content warned of an increasing silence in purgatory, that fewer people believed in its existence and therefore fewer prayed, leaving the captive souls stranded for longer periods. What remains most unsettling, though, is what Sister Maria revealed just before she died. She was completely silent for days, as if preparing herself. Then, with her very last breath, she whispered, "They are louder now." The Vatican avoids discussing her. Her name is not officially recognized as a saint. But among the oldest communities of secluded nuns, her narrative is still shared in rooms lit only by candle on the nights when sleep is difficult to find. And if you pay close attention in those places, some believe you can catch the faint whisper of voices still waiting for remembrance. It began in the year 1294, deep within the dark ages of a Europe ravaged by plague, conflict, and whispers of unorthodoxy. The Holy See had no leader. The papal chair of St. Peter had been vacant for almost 2 years as cardinals argued, strategized, and deliberately stalled. Then, in a deeply unusual action, they elected a man who never had any desire for the role. His name was Pietro del Morone, a hermit living as a monk in a desolate cave high in the mountains of central Italy. He was old, deeply religious, and noted more for his quiet nature than for preaching. When the messengers arrived to inform him he had been selected to become the next pope, he reportedly attempted to run away, but it was too late. The Church's choice was final. and so he was crowned Pope Celestine V. From the very start, it was clear he was unprepared. He wore simple, plain garments, refused to use the official Vatican apartments, and continued to live his life more like a monk than a supreme pontiff. His official decisions were often influenced by other people, and some members of the Curia quickly started to take advantage of his trusting nature for their own goals. Within just 5 months, Celestine astonished the world. He gave up the papacy. This was practically unheard of. Only a tiny number of popes had ever resigned, and none had willingly stepped down in hundreds of years. But Celestine declared that he was unfit for the responsibility of the office and only desired to go back to his life of intense prayer. The Church accepted his decision. A new pope was quickly selected. But this is where the mystery deepens its shadows. The man who replaced him was Cardinal Benedetto Caetani, who became Pope Boniface VIII. And Boniface was anything but a peaceful monk. He was a powerful operator, deeply involved in politics, and committed to controlling both the Church and the kings of Europe. He immediately ordered Celestine to be kept under heavy guard, fearing that other factions might attempt to use the former pope as a challenge to his authority. Celestine was locked away in a tall tower, and there, a few months later, he died. Officially, his passing was peaceful, spent in prayer, but when his remains were later examined, a tiny hole was discovered in his skull. Some people believe this was caused by a nail. Others claim it was the evidence of something much more deliberate, an assassination. But that was only the first resignation. For many centuries, the Church strictly held to the belief that a pope must serve until his death. Yet, in the year 2013, history seemed to repeat itself. Pope Benedict XVI shocked the whole world by resigning from the office. He cited his advancing age and increasing physical weakness. But rumours immediately started swirling about financial corruption in the Vatican Bank, of pressure placed upon him from inside the walls, and of deep secrets too immense for one man to hold. He retreated to a small monastery located within the Vatican walls, and for the very first time in recent memory, the world saw 2 men in white robes inside the same city. 2 popes, one who chose to leave willingly, one who may have had no real choice. And so we have to wonder, was it truly a resignation, or was it a quiet form of forced removal? Echoing a hidden story written down centuries before. In a cold, silent tower and in the quiet stillness of a sealed Vatican archive, far below the foundation of St. Peter's Basilica, rest pages of scripture that the wider world was never intended to discover. These are not fakes or old stories. They are gospels, but they are not the 4 familiar ones you know. Long before the official Bible was finalized as holy writing, early Christian communities did not all read from the same set of accounts. Some followed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Others secretly shared scrolls with names like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Judas. Each one recounted the life of Jesus, but in remarkably different ways. Some mentioned secret teachings. Others revealed mystic visions, strange dreams, and lessons far more radical than what the Church later approved. In the initial centuries, the Christian movement was not a single unified voice, but a complex chorus of many distinct groups that held different ideas about who Jesus was, what he truly taught, and what his message meant. And that fact made the emerging leaders of the Church very anxious. By the year 325, the Roman Emperor Constantine had officially declared Christianity the preferred religion of the entire empire. But to bring together such a massive and rapidly growing faith, something had to be done. A hard decision was made. Certain gospels would be made official, others would be permanently silenced. At the pivotal Council of Nicaea, and in the years that followed, bishops debated and finally voted. The 4 Gospels that we recognise today were accepted as canon. The others, many of them just as ancient, were branded as dangerous heresy. Their devoted followers were pursued and their precious writings were burned or hidden. A single dominant version of the story was being created. Only one version of the truth would be allowed to survive. But not every text was destroyed. In the year 1945, in a remote cave near the city of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a local farmer digging for natural fertilizer unearthed a jar that had been carefully sealed. Inside were 13 papyrus books bound in leather. They had been concealed for well over 1,000 years. Among them were some of those lost Gospels, still completely intact. One of them was the Gospel of Thomas. It contains no accounts of miracles, no crucifixion scene, and no resurrection story. Only quiet, enigmatic sayings of Jesus passed down by word of mouth. Another was the Gospel of Mary, believed to have been written in the name of Mary Magdalene. In its pages, she is not just a passive follower, but a central teacher, one who receives secret knowledge that the male disciples do not. Why were these specific texts kept away from the world? Some scholars believe they posed a serious threat to the institutional power of the Church. Others argue they presented a version of Jesus that was too human, too mystical, or perhaps too politically subversive. Regardless of the reason, the Vatican has never officially adopted them, but it has also never fully denied that they exist. Today, various copies of these Gospels are closely studied by academics worldwide. But the original texts, if they truly exist, may be resting quietly in a deep Vatican vault where no natural light can penetrate, and where no serious questions are permitted to be fully answered. And so the dark mystery lingers. Were these Gospels dismissed for the sake of religious unity, or because they contained a difficult truth the Church could not afford to let surface? In the quiet, deep shadows of the Vatican Library, there are true stories that never managed to make it into the pages of the Bible. Pages that seem to whisper with the sounds of voices long since muted. Stories that present a dramatically different image of Jesus, his trusted disciples, and what truly took place 2,000 years ago. These are the Gospels that failed to be selected, and their complete disappearance was far from accidental. In the early centuries of the growing Christian movement, believers did not rely on only 4 Gospels. There were dozens available. Some had been authored by the very earliest followers, others by people who claimed they possessed secret wisdom passed down through hushed conversations. Among them were names both familiar and unknown. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas. Some read with the lyrical quality of poetry. Others sounded more like a call to outright rebellion. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, avoids telling the narrative of Jesus' life. It offers only a collection of his sayings. Quiet, deeply mysterious lines that feel like riddles drawn from a deep dream. In one part, Jesus declares, "Split a piece of wood and I am there." In another, he speaks not of the concepts of sin and eternal judgment, but of a pure, brilliant light buried deep inside the human spirit. No healing, no cross, no rising from the dead. Just silence and a profound truth. That was the primary problem. As the religion of Christianity expanded in political power, so did its essential need for total control and strict order. In the year 325, the Emperor Constantine gathered various bishops at the Council of Nicaea to finally decide once and for all what Christianity would officially be and what it would absolutely not be. The 4 popular Gospels were chosen, and the rest were quickly and quietly suppressed. Some were systematically burned, others were successfully hidden away, but the vital secrets did not entirely perish. In the hot, dry Egyptian sands near the site of Nag Hammadi, a farmer in the year 1945 broke open a large jar and found scrolls within it. These scrolls had remained concealed for well over a millennium. Among them was the Gospel of Mary. In its pages, Mary Magdalene is not merely a brief mention. She is an esteemed teacher, a spiritual mystic, a respected leader among the male apostles. She speaks of intense visions, of universal forgiveness, of a dramatically different kind of path. and she is met with open anger from the men surrounding her. Even more shocking was the Gospel of Judas. Here, he is not portrayed as a simple villain, but as a deeply trusted inner-circle disciple. A man specially chosen to carry out a terrible, necessary assignment, not as an act of treachery, but as an act of sacred obedience. The entire foundational story is turned completely upside down. The villain is revealed to be a servant. The traditional sinner becomes an instrument of holiness. These important texts were not merely forgotten by chance. They were meticulously cut out, like specific pages ripped from a book that someone urgently did not want you to read. The Vatican has never fully and publicly acknowledged all the Gospels that were removed, but it absolutely knows they exist. Some may even be permanently locked within its deepest archives, far out of reach of any serious scholar. Why were these Gospels ultimately hidden? Were they deemed too mystical, too dangerous to the power structure, or simply too radically different from the approved narrative? We may never know the definitive answer, but the profound question hangs in the air like old incense smoke in a great cathedral. What if the full truth of Jesus was much larger than the narrow story we were eventually provided? And what if that larger story is still being secretly rewritten in the dark? In a quiet, small chamber near the Apostolic Palace, beyond the general access of daylight and most visitors, there sits a simple wooden drawer known only to a very select group of trusted Vatican scribes. It does not make any noise when it is opened, nor does it visually attract any attention. Yet inside, folded with the neatness of forgotten prayers, are personal letters that were never meant to be read, never successfully delivered, never fully answered, and most importantly, never destroyed. Each letter has been written by hand, the ink now greatly faded but still mostly clear. Some are stamped with the official wax seals of popes, others bear the shaky, nervous handwriting of frightened men. And every single one of them carries with it a critical moment of history that never actually reached the world outside the secure walls of the Vatican. One of the most ancient letters bears the name of Pope Celestine V. He was the pope who willingly stepped down in the year 1294, the very first to ever do so voluntarily. His letter was not a formal document, but a deeply personal written confession, composed only days after his election. In it, he desperately pleads for spiritual mercy, claiming he began hearing persistent voices, not from God, but from something else entirely, echoing clearly through the cold stone walls of his secluded cell. He begged to be allowed to go back to his hermitage in the mountains, away from the complicated political machinery of Rome. But the letter was never actually sent. Instead, it was immediately locked away. He resigned the papacy shortly thereafter and was immediately imprisoned by the man who succeeded him. He died in total isolation. Another critical letter was personally addressed to a German priest in the year 1943. It was initially typed and then meticulously rewritten by hand in proper Latin. The author was a senior Vatican official who had personally seen a specific list of names, Jewish families being quietly handed over to high-ranking Nazi officers in exchange for safe passage for other groups. He formally referred to this as a pact of shadows. He urgently begged the priest to keep a hidden copy of this letter in a secure monastery in Austria. But the document never actually reached its intended destination. It was returned, completely unopened, and added to the drawer. There is also a short letter from the year 1981, dated only 2 days before the dramatic assassination attempt on the life of Pope John Paul II. It was left unsigned, written in very rushed Italian, specifically warning the Holy Father not to appear in St. Peter's Square that particular morning. The specific language used was strange, almost like a code, with veiled references to a silent hand and a circle within a circle. The Pope never had the chance to read it. Each one of these letters represents a carefully guarded secret, sealed not with melted wax, but with overwhelming fear. Some were quickly silenced by internal church politics, others by the terrifying pressure of external power, but every single one of them ultimately tells a crucial story the Vatican never once told out loud. And perhaps the most unsettling letter of all rests right at the very bottom of the drawer. It has no clear name, no specific date, only a single chilling line written in Latin, Veritas Mane sub clausura. The truth remains under lock and key. What exact truth? Whose voice does it represent? That is a fundamental question no one has yet dared to fully answer. Not yet. Of all the countless documents buried deep inside the Vatican's private secret archives, there is one document that whispers a deeper sense of fear than any other. It does not glow with the reflected light of gold leaf or shine with the colourful illumination of painted saints. Its fragile pages are dark, notably stained with immense age and soot residue. No formal title is written clearly on its cover. Those very few who know of its existence simply refer to it as the Codex. And according to a terrifying old legend, it accurately predicts the absolute end of all things. The Codex is not stored with the bulk of the other regular manuscripts. It is strictly kept behind a separate, locked iron gate in a room where few people are ever permitted entry, and even fewer actually return. Written in an extremely strange form of Latin, utilizing specific symbols that do not correspond to any known Christian tradition, the book came into the Vatican's possession during the early 1500s. It was delivered by a deeply distressed monk who arrived barefoot, severely bleeding, and with a wild, crazed look in his eyes. He immediately collapsed at the massive gates and died later that very same night. The book was discovered carefully wrapped in old linen cloth underneath his plain cloak. The Codex does not tell a single connected story. Instead, it offers scattered fragments, terrifying visions, cryptic riddles, and dire warnings. It speaks in detail of the skies suddenly turning black over the city of Rome, of a moon that is split into 3 separate pieces, and of a man dressed in white robes weeping amidst an immense fire. Some within the church believe it was simply the work of a seriously disturbed madman. Others firmly believe it was a dark prophecy far too dangerous to ever share with the public. In the year 1963, a respected Vatican scholar named Father Paolo Moretti was granted rare permission to translate just one of the Codex's many entries. What he slowly uncovered profoundly shook him to his core. The detailed passage appeared to describe a future pope who would walk away entirely alone into a growing darkness, while the main basilica burned brightly behind him. It concluded with the deeply unsettling phrase, "The fisherman returns his keys." That same year, Pope John XXIII unexpectedly died, and Pope Paul VI took his place on the throne. An event not officially connected, but quietly discussed in hushed, nervous circles. Moretti's decoded manuscript was permanently hidden. He never again released any writings. Some claim the ancient Codex also makes mention of events we now easily recognize. The emergence of peculiar cosmic bodies, devices that speak yet lack a voice. Children brought up having no awareness of paradise. A single alarming line simply says, "Once the towers collapse, the quiet begins." That exact sentence became relevant again after 2001, when New York City's Twin Towers were destroyed. Once more, the church leadership chose to offer no comment. But perhaps the most disturbing detail about the Codex is not its content, but what it conceals. Pages are torn away, complete portions are covered over, with dark soot and melted wax. And on the last sheet, written in a hand different from the rest of the volume, is a challenging query. If we had foresight of the outcome, would we still speak out? No reigning pope has ever acknowledged reading the book in public. Yet the room where it resides stays secured, the pages remain untouched. And each newly appointed pope is given a small iron key, one that unlocks only one entrance to the volume that should never be accessed. But inevitably, someone will. In the centre of Rome, just outside the Vatican's stone boundaries, There is a legend exchanged quietly among elder scholars and passed on secretly from one curator to another. It is the tale of a woman who almost attained the papacy. Her name, according to certain lost documents, was Johanna. Others refer to her as Joan. No certificate of birth, no marker on a grave, no painting in the ornate reception rooms displays her likeness. But for hundreds of years, the narrative has persisted. It originates in the 9th century, when documentation was scarce and pontiffs quickly gained and lost power, often due to political influence more than true devotion. Johanna was allegedly born in Mainz, a city located in present-day Germany. Possessing a brilliant intellect, she disguised herself as a young man to gain entry into a monastic community. There she learned theology, foreign languages, and philosophy under the name Brother Johannes. Her profound knowledge impressed priests and high-ranking officials. Eventually, she was brought to the capital, where she advanced within the church hierarchy, her true sex concealed by clerical attire and silence. By the year 855, she was chosen as the Pope. The ceremony took place in St. Peter's Square, and for 2 full years Johanna ruled as the ultimate spiritual head of the Catholic Church. Some accounts suggest the populace adored her, noting her wisdom and merciful decisions. Other stories imply she was merely controlled by influential men behind the scenes, but every version agrees on the manner of her downfall. During a formal parade from the Lateran Palace towards St. Peter's Basilica, Johanna suddenly fell to the ground in the street. Initially, the spectators believed she had been poisoned, but then the hidden reality surfaced. She was going into labour. She delivered a child before the astonished gaze of the Roman multitude. Her deception was exposed. Immediately, the infant perished. Some say Johanna also died, either from complications of childbirth or by immediate execution. The Church systematically deleted her history. Her portrait was removed from the official lineup of popes. The incident was never again recorded in official records, but a single piece of evidence remains. In a secluded Roman side street, a sculpture of an unnamed pope still stands. Residents refer to it as Papa Donna, the female pope. Tour operators avoid discussing it. Official Vatican historians deny its significance. But religious travellers still visit, some leaving flowers in tribute. A few even offer quiet prayers, not for her spiritual state, but for the principle she embodies. And here lies the unexpected twist. In the process for electing a new pope. For many centuries following, an unusual ritual occurred. A newly elected pontiff would take a seat on a unique throne with a carved-out opening in the base. A cardinal would reach underneath to physically verify the pope's male anatomy, declaring he possesses testicles and they hang correctly. It sounds preposterous, almost comical. Yet no official explanation was ever offered for why the practice was implemented, only that it began soon after. A prior pope was not exactly who they claimed to be. The Church dismisses it as folklore, but old tales often originate from actual events, and sometimes that truth is crowned in power. Among all the Vatican's secrets, one remains more closely guarded than all others, not because of its contents, but because absolutely no one will ever speak about it. They refer to it simply as the archive, not the official Vatican Apostolic Archive that researchers dream of accessing. This is a location much deeper, concealed beneath heavy marble and hundreds of years of non-disclosure. It is whispered to be situated below a sealed-off sanctuary behind a long passage that abruptly ends in solid rock. No documentation of it exists on official Vatican blueprints. Only a very select few individuals are thought to even know the way there, and none have ever spoken openly. In the early 1960s, a young repair technician named Lorenzo Bellini was brought into the Vatican grounds to fix a subterranean air conditioning unit. He was accompanied by 2 security personnel and instructed not to make inquiries, but he observed one strange detail, a small lift appearing out of place, operated by a metallic key and entirely without buttons. It descended further than the lowest level he had seen on the diagrams. When he inquired about its destination, the guards told him it leads to the place where even the Holy Father must seek permission to enter. Lorenzo never forgot that information. Years later, as he retired and left his position, he shared the story of the elevator with his grandchild. He believed it led to a secure vault that had not been opened for many centuries, not even during times of conflict, not even during changes in papal leadership. According to hushed remarks he overheard among veteran employees, it was the single room in the entire Vatican that had been left undisturbed. The story might have been easily dismissed as a fantasy, but then a letter was found among the personal effects of a recently deceased cardinal. It made specific reference to a location called the Silencio Chamber, not an area for religious books, but a facility for keeping things contained. The cardinal had participated in a confidential council meeting in 1948. He wrote that specific artifacts discovered during World War II were transported back to the Vatican. Some were ancient written materials, predating any found in the Bible. Others were merely described as non-human in their structure. The chamber, he insisted, must forever remain sealed. The unavoidable question, of course, is why? If the Church possessed an item of such immense power, something that could rewrite history or fundamentally challenge belief, would they bring it to light? Or would they choose to hide it, even from their own faithful? No sitting pope has ever acknowledged this chamber. No public tour ever approaches it. And unlike other sections of the archives, there is no formal process to request access, because officially it has no existence. What deeply held secrets lie beyond that locked stone entryway? A forgotten gospel text? Tangible evidence of other life? A severe prophecy for the future? Nobody truly knows. And perhaps that uncertainty is the entire purpose. Some classified collections are secured with physical restraints. Others are protected by enforced silence. And this one, it is whispered, is guarded by sheer terror. Under the faint illumination of an oil lamp within an ancient walkway of the Vatican complex, there is said to be a barrier with no lock, no written words, no handle, just smooth masonry and a stillness that seems too profound to be natural. The clergy who hurry past it do so rapidly, with their heads bowed, because the contents behind it are not discussed publicly or even in private discussions. It is known simply as the final secret. For countless generations, the Vatican has closely held its many mysteries, documents considered too dangerous to disclose, books too bizarre to reproduce, sacred relics that seem to defy time itself. But this particular one is distinct. This secret, some suggest, is not merely concealed from the outside world, it is hidden from the ravages of time itself. The story begins in 1940, during the initial stages of the conflict. A young Jesuit scholar named Father Malachi was dispatched to Lisbon to recover a collection of very old texts. The assignment was low-key, unofficial business. He travelled using forged documents, navigated through war-occupied territories, and returned several weeks later, his hair already prematurely white. He never once spoke of what he had encountered, but the significant change in him was noticeable to others. He stopped his lectures, ceased his writing. The once vibrant priest became withdrawn, entirely quiet, except on one occasion, late at night, when a fellow Jesuit overheard him utter a phrase that caused a sudden chill in the room. They allowed me to witness what happens next. That statement circulated through Vatican halls like smoke escaping a sanctuary. Over the next 10 years, rumours of the final secret intensified. Among those granted clearance to the most classified archives, it was widely believed to involve a future prediction, not the common sort found on brittle scrolls or in private visions, but something actively observed and officially recorded. Some speculate it originated from the chronovisor, the legendary device for viewing time supposedly built by Vatican scientists. Others believe it came from a manuscript far older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Whatever its source, the underlying message was straightforward and deeply unnerving. According to the continuing legend, the final secret details a precise point when the Church will confront a reality so monumental it will either rise completely into a new age or crumble irreversibly into oblivion. A moment not hundreds of years away, but possibly within a single generation. A moment linked not to religious observance, but to something originating from outside all known belief. The last individual known to have read the complete file was a pope who served for only 33 days, Pope John Paul I. Some claim he specifically requested the document late one evening. The following morning, he was discovered deceased, a mere accident or an immediate consequence. To this present day, the Church refuses to confirm the existence of the file, but certain lingering indicators remain. A tightly secured vault under perpetual monitoring, a specific chair in the papal residence that is no longer occupied, and a handwritten note discovered in a deceased cardinal's private safe that simply states, if the truth is revealed, the deception must end. The final secret is not about wealth or political influence. It is fundamentally about the one element the Vatican establishment cannot possibly control, the inevitable conclusion of its self-imposed silence. Thank you for remaining with us throughout this entire journey. If any of these previously concealed narratives sparked your interest or made you re-examine history in a different context, please let us know your thoughts below. We genuinely read every response, and if you found this exploration through the Vatican's most highly protected mysteries compelling, be sure to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss whatever we uncover next. Until then, rest easy, always remain curious, and we will meet again in the next story.